The Library of Alexandria occupies an outsized place in the cultural imagination as the ultimate symbol of lost knowledge. Popular narratives present it as a singular, monolithic institution housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls from every known civilization of the ancient world. The image conjured is that of a temple of wisdom, tragically consumed by fire, resulting in an irreparable rupture in human intellectual continuity. However, this perception is not supported by consistent historical documentation. Rather, it is a modern construct shaped by retrospective idealization, often divorced from the fragmentary and ambiguous evidence available about the library's actual operation, scope, and structure. The notion that the library housed all knowledge rests on the claim that it sought to collect every book in existence. This idea is mainly derived from isolated accounts in later Greek and Roman sources, including mentions in texts by Strabo, Aulus Gellius, and Plutarch. Yet these sources often wrote centuries after the library's prime, and they do so with little consistency or corroboration. The numbers frequently cited, such as 400,000 or 700,000 scrolls, are likely speculative and symbolic, reflecting rhetorical exaggeration rather than empirical inventory. The absence of primary catalogues or administrative records from the library's own period forces any estimation into the realm of supposition rather than fact. Moreover, the assumption that the library was a public or universally accessible space for open learning is not grounded in the structure of Ptolemaic society. Ancient libraries, unlike modern ones, functioned as elite repositories. Access to texts, particularly rare or foreign ones, was tightly controlled. The custodians of knowledge were appointed philologists, scholars, and administrators tied closely to the court. These figures not only preserved but also interpreted and edited the texts according to the prevailing ideologies. The common conception of the library as a neutral space for intellectual pluralism neglects the political realities of its operation. The portrayal of the library as a single building is also misleading. The main facility, often referred to in relation to the Mausion, is thought to have been situated in the royal quarter of Alexandria. However, historical sources also mention a secondary library housed in the Serapeum. It remains unclear how the two were related in terms of administration, content, and function. More broadly, the practice of textual storage and curation likely extended beyond these two sites. The library may have functioned less like a singular vault and more like a node within a wider cultural infrastructure, including scriptoriums, private collections, and temple archives. The emphasis on one central structure creates an architectural myth that obscures the complexity and distribution of Alexandrian knowledge management. The narrative of destruction by fire also deserves scrutiny. While several incidents of fire affecting parts of Alexandria are historically attested, such as Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, the revolt under Aurelian in the 3rd century CE, and the later Christian-Muslim conflicts, the specific destruction of the library is not clearly documented. Different historical accounts contradict each other, with some suggesting the burning of the docks where scrolls were stored temporarily, others implying later and more gradual decline rather than a singular, catastrophic event. The popular image of a blaze consuming all knowledge in a single night appears more as a metaphor than a verifiable event. It reflects a modern fascination with dramatic loss rather than accurate historiography. These myths are not neutral. They shape expectations about what the library was, what it contained, and what its loss signifies. By framing the library as the lost origin of rational inquiry, science, and universal truth, the narrative implicitly upholds a linear, Western-centric model of intellectual development. It ignores the many centers of knowledge production that existed simultaneously or prior to Alexandria, such as those in Mesopotamia, India, China, and Mesoamerica. The idea that the loss of the Library of Alexandria halted the progression of knowledge presumes that this one institution held a monopoly on truth, marginalizing other epistemic traditions in the process. The mythologization of the library also introduces a selective memory about who had the power to write, store, and preserve texts. It glosses over the question of whose knowledge was archived and whose was excluded. Ancient libraries were not democratic institutions. Their collections were shaped by conquest, diplomacy, trade, and ideological filtering. Texts that aligned with the dominant worldview were more likely to be preserved and canonized. Others, deemed heretical, foreign, or subversive, were redacted, mistranslated, or simply left unrecorded. The library, far from being an impartial custodian of global wisdom, functioned as a mechanism of intellectual gatekeeping. This section serves as a foundation by deconstructing the romanticized image of the Library of Alexandria. It raises key questions about the historical accuracy of popular narratives and introduces skepticism toward the assumptions that have dominated public and academic discourse. This skepticism is not merely an act of revisionism, it is a necessary precondition for investigating the deeper, less visible processes that shape the legacy of Alexandrian knowledge, especially the practice of redaction. By stripping away the myth, one begins to see the outline of a more complex and politically entangled institution, one whose control over texts was not only a matter of preservation, but also of deliberate transformation. This inquiry lays the groundwork for tracing how such transformations occurred, who enacted them, and to what end. The widely held belief that the Library of Alexandria functioned as a singular, centralized institution is one of the most persistent misconceptions in the historical narrative. Despite repeated references to a definitive library with a capital L, close inspection of ancient sources reveals a far more complex and fragmented system of textual storage and management. The idea of a solitary monumental edifice, a kind of ancient equivalent to a modern national archive, is not only historically unsubstantiated, but also structurally anachronistic. Ancient knowledge systems did not rely on single points of collection, but operated through diffuse, hierarchical, and often compartmentalized networks. The Alexandria of the Ptolemaic period was no exception. Evidence for a dual library system emerges in various ancient texts, particularly the accounts of the main library located within the Mausion, and a second repository situated within the Serapeum. The Mausion, founded under the Ptolemies as a royal research institution, functioned as a center for elite scholarship. It served not only as a place of study but also as a residence for scholars under royal patronage. The main library was likely attached to this institution, both physically and administratively. However, much less is concretely known about its exact layout, internal organization, and content classification. No floor plans, inventories, or administrative records have survived. The assumptions about its structure are reconstructions based on comparative analysis and literary references, many of which are contradictory or speculative. The so-called daughter library in the Serapeum associated with the Temple of Serapis is often considered a secondary branch. While some historical sources suggest it functioned as an overflow repository for scrolls, others imply it had a more autonomous identity. It is unclear whether the Serapeum collection was identical in organization or purpose to that of the Mausion, or whether it held a different class of texts entirely, perhaps more religious or ritualistic in nature. The conflation of these two sites into a unified narrative about the library collapses the internal distinctions that may have existed in how different forms of knowledge were archived, accessed, or redacted. Beyond the Mausion and Serapeum, there is reason to suspect the existence of additional archival spaces throughout Alexandria. The city was a hub of multilingual, multicultural activity. It contained numerous temples, schools, and private academies, each potentially maintaining their own collections of texts. Egyptian priesthoods, Greek philosophical schools, Jewish, scribal traditions, and even commercial institutions likely maintained their own scriptoriums. These entities were not passive repositories, but active participants in the production, editing, and interpretation of texts. The assumption that the Ptolemaic administration monopolized all intellectual activity under the roof of a single library erases the complexity of Alexandria as a vibrant, competitive knowledge economy. Moreover, the process of acquiring texts did not rely solely on conquest or confiscation. While it is true that Ptolemaic agents famously seized scrolls from ships entering Alexandria's harbour, there were also organized efforts to obtain manuscripts through diplomatic exchanges, copying, expeditions, and even scholarly collaboration. This distributed method of acquisition implies a corresponding distribution in storage and classification. Logistical constraints alone would have necessitated a decentralized archival infrastructure. The technical limitations of ancient scroll preservation, sensitivity to humidity, fragility, categorization challenges rendered the idea of a single monolithic warehouse implausible. The myth of a centralized building also distorts the dynamics of access and control. If a knowledge was spread across multiple locations, then so too was authority. Each institution or group controlling a particular cache of texts had its own priorities, interpretive frameworks, and redaction practices. This decentralization complicates the question of who exactly was responsible for altering, editing, or omitting content. The impulse to identify a singular agent or institution responsible for redaction is undermined by the likelihood that multiple, sometimes conflicting, redaction processes occurred simultaneously across different nodes of the Alexandrian knowledge web. In this context, the notion of the library as an instrument of state control must be recalibrated. While the Ptolemaic dynasty certainly exerted influence over key components of the system, particularly the Mouseion, the full landscape of Alexandrian textuality was more diffuse and contested. Competing interest groups, philosophical schools, and religious factions all contributed to shaping what was recorded, copied, altered, or destroyed. This distributed authorship makes it more difficult, but also more urgent, to trace patterns of redaction. It demands an analytical approach that examines not only centralized decisions, but also peripheral edits, marginal omissions, and subtle misattributions carried out across the network. The ramifications for redaction are profound. In a decentralized system, redaction was not merely a top-down phenomenon. It occurred horizontally through scribal practices, translation choices, and intertextual reinterpretation. A single concept or narrative could undergo multiple iterations depending on its custodial context. A religious myth might be retained in one repository while being expunged or allegorized in another. A historical account might be sanitized for political purposes by one group, while a different version was maintained in a rival tradition. The multiplicity of repositories introduced a multiplicity of editorial logics, each reflecting distinct power relations. This framework also helps explain the survival of certain counter-traditional or apocryphal texts in later centuries. It is possible that some texts evaded the dominant redactional regime not because of institutional oversight, but because they were archived outside the reach of centralized control. Private libraries, temple scroll rooms, or foreign embassies may have preserved versions of texts that were excised from the Mouseion or Serapeum. Their survival is not accidental, but rather indicative of an alternative logic of textual transmission, one that operated in tension with and occasionally in defiance of the hegemonic order. By moving beyond the notion of a single building, one also moves beyond the notion of a single intent. Redaction, in this light, becomes not a singular event, but a systemic phenomenon. It is embedded within the architecture of knowledge itself, its physical storage, its institutional governance, and its intertextual evolution. The Library of Alexandria was not a vault, it was a battlefield of ideas. Its walls were not stone but scribes, its doors not wood but access protocols, and its flames not merely physical but ideological. Recognizing the library as a distributed and heterogeneous system allows for a deeper investigation into the mechanisms of redaction. It opens the path to asking more precise questions about which actors controlled which archives, under what epistemological frameworks, and for what strategic purposes. The simplification of the library into a single locus of loss distorts these processes. Only by dismantling the myth of architectural centrality can one begin to trace the true routes through which texts were altered, suppressed, or weaponized in ancient Alexandria. Ownership of the scrolls housed within the Alexandrian complex was not merely a question of property, but of ideological dominance, political strategy, and cultural capital. The idea of possession in the context of ancient texts must be disentangled from modern notions of copyright or archival responsibility. In the Alexandrian ecosystem, to own a scroll meant to control its content, determine its accessibility, and define its interpretive framework. This control was exercised not only by royal authority but also by a network of actors including temple authorities, philosophical schools, state-appointed scholars, and foreign emissaries. Each group had distinct motivations and methodologies, and their overlapping claims to ownership shaped the redactional fate of the scrolls. The Ptolemaic dynasty presented itself not only as a political power, but as a cultural intermediary. After taking control of Egypt following the death of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies quickly realized that legitimacy in a multi-ethnic empire required more than military dominance. It required ideological coherence. The library and Mausion became instruments through which this coherence could be engineered. The acquisition of scrolls by forced seizure, purchase, or copying was not merely about accumulation, but about epistemological control. Every scroll acquired was a narrative potentially aligned or at odds with Ptolemaic goals. The dynasty had a vested interest in reshaping the textual record to reflect a syncretic worldview, where Greek rationalism, Egyptian tradition, and Macedonian imperialism coexisted under their hegemony. Ownership also extended into intellectual authorship. The appointed scholars of the Mausion, who were provided housing, stipends, and prestige, did not simply preserve texts. They altered them. They acted as interpreters, editors, and sometimes authors in their own right. By rewriting, reclassifying, or annotating existing works, they inserted themselves into the textual lineage. This editorial function gave them ownership not just of the physical scrolls, but of the ideas they contained. It was an ownership of meaning. Their modifications were rarely marked as redactions. Instead, they were framed as corrections, clarifications, or restorations of a supposedly original truth. In reality, these interventions often displaced older interpretations or marginalized dissenting voices. Philosophical schools also exerted a form of custodianship. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan intellectual center where peripatetic, Stoic, and, later, Neoplatonist traditions converged and competed. Each school developed its own canons of legitimate knowledge and often treated texts as vessels for propagating their doctrines. A historical account could be interpreted allegorically to serve metaphysical agendas, while a scientific text could be redacted to conform to a specific ontological framework. In such cases, redaction was not a deliberate falsification, but a doctrinal necessity. The schools did not believe they were distorting the truth, they believed they were uncovering it. Nonetheless, these interpretive overlays resulted in textual transformations that functionally erased alternative readings. The temple authorities of Egypt, who held their own hieratic and demotic texts, engaged in similar processes. Their custodianship involved not only religious texts, but also astronomical, medical, and architectural knowledge. Ptolemaic rulers initially allowed a degree of autonomy to Egyptian priesthoods as part of a broader strategy of co-optation. However, over time, Greek scholars began to reinterpret Egyptian texts through Hellenistic paradigms. Translations from hieroglyphs into Greek were not value-neutral. They introduced distortions, intentional or otherwise, that reframed Egyptian cosmology in terms comprehensible to Greek rationalism. In many cases, this process led to a form of epistemic colonialism. Indigenous frameworks were displaced by imported ones, and the original meaning of the texts was obscured or overwritten. Foreign aid. Emissaries and embassies also participated in the Alexandrian intellectual economy. It is recorded that texts borrowed from Athens or acquired from the Near East were sometimes never returned, or were returned only in the form of altered copies. This raises critical questions about the ethics of ownership and the authenticity of surviving versions. If an original manuscript from, say, Babylon was copied and retained in Alexandria, while the source was returned in modified form, then which version constitutes the authoritative text? The Alexandrian model of custodianship created layers of redacted knowledge, each filtered through cultural and political interests. Economic elites also played a role in private custodianship. Wealthy Alexandrians maintained personal libraries, often curated by hired scribes or scholars. These collections were not under state control, and their contents varied widely. Some served as status symbols containing rare or exotic texts. Others functioned as independent centers of inquiry. The existence of such private collections complicates the picture of centralized redaction. Some redactions may have been resisted or circumvented in these spaces, allowing for the preservation of variant readings. At the same time, private custodians may have initiated their own forms of redaction, motivated by aesthetic preference, doctrinal alignment, or social pressure. The multiplicity of ownership also had legal implications. Disputes over the provenance of certain texts occasionally led to diplomatic tension. There are scattered reports of rival cities demanding the return of their cultural property, citing unauthorized seizure or non-consensual copying. These conflicts suggest that textual ownership was not merely a symbolic matter but a political one with real consequences for intercity and international relations. Control over a foundational text could confer prestige, ideological leverage, or even claims to historical primacy. In summary, the question of who owned the scrolls in Alexandria is inseparable from the broader question of who controlled knowledge. Ownership in this context was not static or singular. It was contested, layered, and deeply political. The scrolls were not inert objects of study. They were active instruments in the construction of reality. To possess a text was to control the framework through which history, science, religion, and identity were understood. This multiplicity of ownership created a complex matrix of influence within which redaction was not an aberration but a norm. It was a systemic feature of the Alexandrian knowledge economy, an economy driven not by the pursuit of truth in the abstract, but by the management of narratives in the service of power. Redaction, as a deliberate act of modifying textual material, is often mistakenly regarded as a rare or marginal phenomenon in antiquity. In reality, it was a central and routine mechanism in the transmission and evolution of knowledge across multiple ancient civilizations. Far from being an aberration, redaction was embedded into the intellectual and bureaucratic fabric of empires, religious orders, philosophical schools, and scribal institutions. It served both epistemological and political functions, shaping the interpretive boundaries of recorded memory. In the Alexandrian context, redaction must be seen not as a rupture from tradition, but as an extension of long-standing editorial practices that had been institutionalized centuries earlier across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. In Mesopotamia, The earliest evidence of systematic textual redaction can be found in the cuneiform traditions of Sumer and Akkad. Royal scribes maintained temple libraries containing administrative records, legal codes, omen series, medical treatises, and ritual texts. These collections were curated through copying, annotation, and substitution. New political regimes routinely modified existing texts to align them with current dynastic narratives. Mythologies were adjusted to incorporate emerging deities or downplay older cults. Genealogies were restructured to retroactively legitimize the ruling class. In this system, the scribe was not merely a transmitter of content, but an agent of ideological reproduction. Such practices laid the groundwork for the later manipulation of texts in Alexandria. Ancient Egypt also institutionalized redaction through temple scriptoria. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on tombs and monuments, as well as papyri containing medical, astronomical, and ritual knowledge, were often revised to fit evolving theological or cosmological frameworks. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, exists in numerous variant forms, each reflecting local traditions or updated interpretations. The presence of textual variants is not evidence of error, but of intentional recalibration. Priestly editors shaped the presentation of divine order to align with political contingencies or religious reforms. These redactions were considered part of the authoritative tradition, not deviations from it. The illusion of an unbroken, immutable canon was itself a result of editorial labor. Greek traditions also embraced redactional methodologies, albeit under different philosophical assumptions. In Homeric scholarship, the practice of rhapsodic composition involved reconfiguring and expanding epic narratives based on regional preferences or audience expectations. The Homeric epics were subject to interpolations, deletions, and reorganizations. Long before their supposed standardization under Alexandrian philologists. Furthermore, philosophical texts by pre-Socratic thinkers often survive only in fragments preserved by later commentators who interpreted or misinterpreted them according to contemporary frameworks. The act of preservation was simultaneously an act of reinterpretation which necessarily entailed editorial transformation. The Alexandrian redactional project built upon these precedents, but elevated them into a comprehensive system. The scholars of the Mausion did not simply collect texts. They restructured them according to rigorous editorial protocols. Figures like Zenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace applied grammatical, metrical, and stylistic criteria to modify and correct inherited works. Their interventions often became more authoritative than the originals they claimed to purify. The designation of a particular version of Homer or Hesiod as canonical was not an objective act of recovery but a subjective act of reconstruction. Variants were dismissed as corruptions, even when they reflected legitimate alternative traditions. Redaction was not limited to literary or poetic works. Scientific and philosophical texts were also subject to systematic reshaping. Theoretical treatises were edited to conform to dominant cosmologies or mathematical paradigms. Texts on medicine or astronomy were sometimes modified to erase references to foreign systems or to harmonize contradictory theories. These edits were rarely disclosed. The authority of a redacted text was reinforced by the absence of attribution to any editor, creating the illusion of continuity and authenticity. Anonymity was not a result of carelessness but a deliberate strategy to conceal intervention. Religious texts underwent some of the most profound redactional transformations. Hellenistic syncretism produced composite deities, fused cosmologies, and hybrid liturgies. Religious scrolls that entered Alexandria, whether from Jewish, Zoroastrian, Babylonian, or Egyptian sources, were subjected to interpretive filtration. Allegorical reading was employed to neutralize theological contradictions. In some cases, ritual instructions were translated into symbolic metaphors stripping them of their original performative context. This not only altered the meaning of the texts, but transformed their function. What was once a practical manual could become a philosophical treatise. What was once a theological assertion could be recast as mythic poetry. The process of redaction was not cosmetic but ontological. It changed what a text was. Translation itself was a major vehicle for redaction. Rendering a text from one language into another necessarily involves interpretive decisions. Word choice, syntax, and cultural references cannot be transferred without loss or substitution. In Alexandria, the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, is a prime example. The Greek version introduced shifts in theological emphasis, chronological ordering, and narrative detail. These changes were not uniformly recognized by contemporary readers, many of whom lacked access to the originals. Translation thus became a covert mechanism for redaction, carried out under the guise of accessibility. The status of authorship was also affected by redaction. Many texts from antiquity were attributed to famous names: Pythagoras, Orpheus, Hermes Trismegistus, whose actual involvement is questionable. Pseudepigraphy was a common editorial tactic used to lend authority to newly composed or redacted works. A text modified in Alexandria might be reissued under the name of an ancient sage, giving it retroactive legitimacy. This practice blurred the boundary between preservation and fabrication. It allowed redactors to reshape content while maintaining the illusion of continuity with an idealized past. The prevalence of redaction in antiquity undermines modern assumptions about textual stability. Scholars and readers often seek an original or uncorrupted version of ancient texts, unaware that such a version may never have existed. What we encounter in manuscripts, papyri, or codices are products of centuries of revision, omission, and recontextualization. Even when redaction is acknowledged, it is often treated as a footnote rather than as a central dynamic in the history of knowledge. In the Alexandrian context, redaction must be understood as a standard operating procedure. It was not hidden because it was not considered problematic within the epistemic frameworks of the time. The idea that a text could or should remain unchanged across generations was foreign to the editorial logics of ancient institutions. Stability was achieved not through fidelity to an original, but through alignment with current intellectual, political, or theological needs. This systemic understanding of redaction provides a necessary analytical tool for the subsequent investigation of specific actors and motives. The process was not random. It followed discernible patterns, operated under identifiable pressures, and produced concrete effects on the intellectual record. The redacted texts that survive from Alexandria are not just incomplete, they are curated. To study them critically requires a methodology that does not simply look for what is present, but questions why certain elements are absent. Redaction is not a layer to be peeled back. It is a structure to be interrogated. The transition from custodianship to censorship in the management of ancient texts is neither abrupt nor isolated. It represents a structural evolution in the exercise of power over knowledge. Initially framed as a duty of preservation, the custodianship of scrolls in Alexandria gradually became a mechanism of exclusion, manipulation, and epistemic control. This shift was not marked by a single policy or event, but by a pattern of interventions, driven by changing political, philosophical, and religious imperatives. What began as the organization and safekeeping of texts transformed into the strategic removal, alteration, or concealment of ideas perceived as inconvenient, heretical, or subversive. The custodians of the library, particularly the scholar officials, under Ptolemaic patronage, were tasked with maintaining the integrity of the textual corpus. On the surface, this responsibility entailed organizing manuscripts, correcting corruptions, and standardizing formats. But within that administrative Authority was embedded the power to define what constituted corruption in the first place. In the absence of an objective standard, the selection of variant readings, the exclusion of apocryphal passages, or the reattribution of authorship all amounted to acts of censorship masked as editorial refinement. The redactional labor, once understood as curatorial, evolved into an ideologically charged activity. Censorship in Alexandria was not necessarily carried out with explicit bans or public decrees. It was subtle, systemic, and self-justifying. Texts deemed redundant, confusing, or doctrinally incompatible were often omitted from catalogues. Scrolls that contradicted prevailing philosophical trends were marked as spurious or misattributed. These judgments were embedded in commentaries and marginal notes, influencing future copyists and interpreters. Over time, such editorial decisions calcified into canon. The original scrolls may not have been destroyed outright, but their accessibility was curtailed, their legitimacy questioned, and their intellectual value diminished. Censorship thus operated through mechanisms of classification, shelving priority, and citation omission. An important tool in this transformation was the index. While often presented as neutral instruments of organization, indices reflect and reinforce editorial hierarchies. The inclusion or exclusion of a text from an official register directly impacted its survival and influence. Works unlisted were less likely to be copied, less likely to be taught, and more likely to fall into oblivion. The Alexandrian scholars, especially those engaged in cataloguing under Callimachus, exercised enormous influence in shaping the reference landscape of future generations. Decisions made during this phase would determine which authors were remembered and which were forgotten. Moreover, the editorial prerogative was frequently exercised along ideological lines, as Stoic, Peripatetic, and Platonist schools vied for dominance. Texts that conflicted with their metaphysical assumptions were marginalized. Atomist materialism, associated with figures like Democritus and Leucippus, was particularly susceptible to this form of soft censorship. While not formally banned, atomist doctrines were gradually displaced by texts emphasizing teleology and divine order. Commentaries were crafted to reinterpret older texts through the lens of newer, more acceptable doctrines. Over time, the original intent of certain writings was overwritten by successive layers of interpretation that erased or distorted their foundational ideas. Religious concerns also catalyzed the shift from custodianship to censorship. As Alexandria became a melting pot of religious ideologies, tensions between polytheism, Judaism, emerging Christianity, and Hellenistic syncretism intensified. The preservation of sacred texts was no longer a matter of passive storage, but of theological negotiation. Competing cosmologies could not coexist indefinitely within the same intellectual space. Editorial interventions were used to harmonize discordant theologies or to eliminate contradictions. In some cases, this led to the fusion of mythologies. In others, to the quiet disappearance of texts incompatible with the dominant narrative. This was not destruction through fire, but through erasure by silence. Linguistic translation played a critical role in the censorship dynamic. As texts were rendered from Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, and other languages into Greek, translation became a process of ideological filtration. Untranslatable concepts were often omitted or replaced with approximations that altered the underlying meaning. Metaphysical frameworks incompatible with Greek philosophical structures were recast or allegorized. This process was rarely acknowledged as censorship. It was justified as necessary adaptation for comprehension. However, the cumulative effect was the neutralization of foreign epistemologies and the imposition of a homogenized intellectual schema that privileged Hellenistic norms. Censorship also took the form of strategic ambiguity. Some texts were preserved but rendered cryptic through commentary. By reframing a historical account as symbolic myth, or a theological treatise as philosophical metaphor, editors could neutralize the literal force of a text without openly discarding it. This form of epistemic domestication allowed for the retention of scrolls without granting them interpretive autonomy. In effect, the original intent of the author was censored by enveloping it within a framework that precluded dissenting interpretations. The authority to censor was further enhanced by the physical fragility of the medium. Scrolls required regular copying to survive. The decision to copy a text was itself a judgment about its worth. Scrolls that were not copied would decay, especially in the humid climate of Alexandria. By selectively denying reproduction, custodians could allow a text to perish without direct prohibition. This passive form of censorship left no overt trace but was nonetheless effective in shaping the canon. The absence of a text from later references is not always evidence of its insignificance. It may be evidence of strategic neglect. Censorship in Alexandria was thus multifaceted. It was implemented through editorial framing, classification systems, translation choices, and reproduction decisions. It emerged not as a formal policy, but as a convergence of scholarly practice and institutional interest. The line between preservation and control became increasingly blurred as the custodians of knowledge assumed the role of its gatekeepers. The archive became a site not only of memory but of forgetfulness, a forgetfulness produced by methodical exclusion. This transition has profound implications for how modern scholars engage with ancient texts. The versions that survive are not neutral witnesses of antiquity but curated artifacts. Their content reflects a series of ideological decisions made by individuals and institutions with specific agendas. The process of redaction, already documented in the previous section, must therefore be seen as operating within a broader framework of censorship. This framework did not destroy knowledge overtly, it redefined it from within. Alexandria's transformation from archive to filter was neither sudden nor visible. It was slow, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. The emergence of Alexandrian philology marked a turning point in the history of knowledge control, establishing new standards for textual scrutiny while simultaneously embedding systems of epistemic authority. The term philology, in its Alexandrian usage, extended beyond linguistic analysis. It encompassed the systematic editing, annotation, organization, and often transformation of texts. The scholars who spearheaded this movement were not peripheral custodians, but central architects of the intellectual regime of the Ptolemaic state. Their rise was neither spontaneous nor benign. It was a consequence of political design and institutional consolidation. In claiming to clarify the texts of antiquity, these philologists often concealed how deeply they modified them. The earliest wave of Alexandrian philologists operated under the protection and funding of the Ptolemaic court. Figures such as Zenodotus of Ephesus, the first recorded head of the library, began developing methods for textual emendation that would become foundational. Zenodotus introduced editorial symbols, eliminated what he deemed spurious lines from Homeric texts, and established a principle of restoration that allowed for silent intervention. What he and his successors called restoration was, in practice, a process of selective elimination and standardization. Multiple versions of epics, myths, and historical narratives existed across the Greek world, often tailored to local traditions. The Alexandrian philologists sought to collapse this multiplicity into singular, fixed versions that reflected Hellenistic ideological preferences. The motives were as much political as they were intellectual. By producing definitive versions of foundational Greek texts, the Alexandrian philologists reinforced a centralized cultural narrative. This allowed the Ptolemaic rulers, foreign Macedonians in an Egyptian land, to present themselves as legitimate inheritors of Greek civilizational authority. Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians were not only literary treasures but ideological tools. Establishing their correct versions within the controlled environment of Alexandria meant that all derivative commentaries, interpretations, or educational curricula would depend on the sanctioned redactions. In this way, philology became a gatekeeping mechanism. Aristophanes of Byzantium, a later director of the library, expanded this project further. He introduced rigorous grammatical analysis into the editorial process, dissecting texts based on dialectical purity, syntactic propriety, and stylistic uniformity. The assumption underlying this methodology was that there existed an ideal form of the Greek language and that deviation from it constituted corruption. This linguistic idealism allowed for the systematic exclusion of regional variants, oral, remnants, and foreign influences. The resulting texts were not originals in any historical sense. They were reconstructions, curated to meet the aesthetic and ideological standards of a narrow elite. Another towering figure, Aristarchus of Samothrace, brought the project of redaction to its most sophisticated stage. He produced editions of Homer that became canonical for centuries, often removing lines, reordering passages, and inserting critical glosses that shaped interpretation. Aristarchus developed a system of marginal annotations known as scholia, which guided readers toward specific readings while appearing to remain objective. These annotations often displaced rival interpretations, relegating them to footnotes or erasing them entirely. The appearance of critical rigor masked a deeper logic of control. The scholia not only annotated the text, they regulated its meaning. The role of classification was also central. Callimachus, although not a philologist in the strictest sense, compiled the Pinnaces, an elaborate bibliographic catalogue of the library's contents. This act of cataloguing was not neutral. It involved decisions about thematic relevance, authorship, and hierarchical importance. Texts were assigned to categories that reflected Alexandrian intellectual priorities. The mere inclusion or exclusion of a text from a recognized category could determine its survival or oblivion. The Pinnaces became a canonical structure through which access to knowledge was filtered, organizing an otherwise unmanageable archive into a comprehensible and ideologically legible corpus. The methodologies of Alexandrian philology were also deeply embedded in a worldview that equated order with truth. Disorder, be it linguistic, narrative, or philosophical, was viewed as a sign of corruption. This orientation justified the erasure of multiplicity in favor of synthesized uniformity. It also provided cover for acts of censorship framed as necessary interventions to correct previous mistakes or corruptions. The textual corpus became a battleground, and philologists served as both curators and combatants. Their power was not derived from authorship, but from the ability to adjudicate between versions, to elevate one variant and suppress another. Importantly, these editorial interventions were rarely marked as such in the final texts. Redactional decisions were integrated seamlessly, without explanatory notes or historical justification. Future generations encountering these texts would often be unaware that they were engaging with heavily modified versions. The redacted texts acquired an aura of antiquity even when their form was a product of relatively recent intervention. This created a false sense of continuity, masking the ruptures introduced by the philologists themselves. Moreover, the dominance of Alexandrian redactions was reinforced through the education system. As the revised texts were disseminated across the Hellenistic world, they became the basis for rhetorical training, philosophical commentary, and literary imitation. Students learned from the redacted versions, teachers taught from them, and commentators elaborated upon them. Alternative versions, if they survived at all, were increasingly relegated to marginal status. This self-reinforcing cycle ensured the longevity of the Alexandrian corpus and its interpretive frameworks. The rise of philology in Alexandria thus represents a critical moment in the institutionalization of redaction as an intellectual norm. The editors did not see themselves as manipulators of truth, but as its custodians. Their commitment to order, clarity, and coherence aligned with the broader political and cultural objectives of the Ptolemaic state. The fact that their interventions were often concealed only added to their effectiveness. By defining what counted as legitimate knowledge and by concealing the processes by which that legitimacy was established, Alexandrian philologists created a lasting infrastructure of epistemic authority, one that continues to influence textual scholarship to this day. Understanding the machinery of Alexandrian philology is essential for any inquiry into the redaction of texts during this period. It reveals that redaction was not a clandestine activity, but a professionalized discipline. The editors were not outsiders, they were the intellectual elite, operating at the center of the most powerful library in the ancient world. Their decisions shaped the intellectual inheritance of entire civilizations. They did not merely transcribe knowledge, they manufactured it. The function of the Library of Alexandria and its editorial apparatus cannot be understood in isolation from the political objectives of the Ptolemaic regime. The institution was not merely a scholarly enclave, it was a carefully constructed arm of state power. Its development, operations, and outputs were integrated into a broader strategy aimed at consolidating authority over a diverse and potentially fractious population. The Ptolemies, as a Macedonian dynasty ruling over an Egyptian majority within a multicultural urban population, faced the persistent challenge of legitimation. Textual control through the library was one of their primary tools for producing ideological cohesion and historical narrative alignment. The establishment of the library coincided with the rise of the Ptolemaic monarchy's administrative ambitions. Following the fragmentation of Alexander's empire, Ptolemy I Soter inherited a vast territory with complex social strata. Native Egyptian priesthoods, Greek settlers, Jewish communities, and foreign mercantile enclaves. Each of these groups possessed distinct traditions, languages, and historical memories. Rather than pursue a policy of eradication, the Ptolemies sought to subsume and reorient existing systems of knowledge. The library functioned as a site where these systems could be collected, edited, and reordered in accordance with a syncretic state ideology. Redaction was instrumental in neutralizing cognitive dissonance and presenting a unified cultural framework. Royal sponsorship of the library was not driven purely by philosophical curiosity. It was a means to establish soft power across the Hellenistic world. The possession of rare and authoritative texts enhanced the dynasty's prestige, much like the acquisition of statues, obelisks, or foreign relics. The exportation of Alexandrian redactions, such as canonical versions of Homer or Greek translations of Semitic texts, allowed the Ptolemies to influence educational curricula and cultural discourse far beyond the borders of Egypt. The redacted corpus became an intellectual export, reinforcing Alexandria's status as the epicenter of legitimate knowledge. This influence required a robust infrastructure of acquisition and control. The library's scrolls were not passively received, they were actively collected through an aggressive program that included the confiscation of texts from ships docked in Alexandria, the requisitioning of manuscripts from other cities, and the copying of foreign texts under opaque terms. The acquisition process itself was often coercive, backed by the authority of the crown. Reports suggest that when original manuscripts were borrowed from foreign libraries, for example, from Athens, they were not returned, or were returned only in altered form. This practice illustrates the Ptolemaic regime's willingness to subordinate ethical considerations to the strategic value of textual dominance. Once in the library, these texts entered a tightly controlled editorial pipeline. The scholars appointed To oversee them operated under the implicit directive of ideological harmonization. While they possessed autonomy in philological methods, their overarching framework was dictated by court imperatives. Texts that supported the dynasty's lineage, reinforced Hellenistic cosmology, or aligned with Egyptian-Greek syncretism were prioritized. Others were sequestered, edited beyond recognition, or excluded from catalogues. The involvement of the monarchy was not merely financial or ceremonial, it was programmatic. The knowledge corpus became a curated expression of state ideology designed to reinforce dynastic stability and cultural supremacy. Religious texts were a particular focal point of state-directed redaction. The Ptolemies promoted the cult of Serapis, a hybrid deity combining aspects of Greek and Egyptian divinities as a symbolic embodiment of their regime's syncretic aspirations. The construction of the Serapeum and the transfer of theological texts into its subsidiary library reinforced this initiative. Redactions of religious manuscripts often involved the suppression of incompatible narratives or the reinterpretation of myths to accommodate the new theological synthesis. These edits were not merely theological, they were acts of statecraft. By aligning divine authority with dynastic interests, the Ptolemies secured spiritual legitimacy alongside political control. Historical records were similarly manipulated. The Ptolemaic regime encouraged the compilation of chronologies that validated its place in the Hellenic tradition while marginalizing rival lineages. Genealogical tables were restructured, and foreign kings were reframed as barbaric or peripheral. Egyptian dynastic records were reinterpreted to fit Greek historiographical models. In this way, the redacted past became a mirror for the present, affirming the legitimacy of the rulers and the inevitability of their dominion. This manipulation of temporal narratives transformed the library into an institution not of memory, but of fabrication. Linguistic control further deepened the regime's grip. Greek became the primary language of scholarly discourse in Alexandria, marginalizing native Egyptian scripts and Semitic languages. Translation served as a gatekeeping device, determining which texts could enter the official corpus and in what form. In the process, entire conceptual frameworks were either lost or forcibly adapted. The translated works reflected the assumptions of their editors more than the intentions of their original authors. This linguistic filtering was not simply a pragmatic choice, it was a means of cultural reshaping carried out under the authority of a state-backed knowledge regime. Administrative coordination between the library, the Mausion, and other state institutions ensured that redacted texts were disseminated strategically. They were embedded into curricula, cited in legal decisions, and used in diplomatic correspondence. The redacted knowledge corpus became the intellectual infrastructure of the state. Its influence reached into education, law, religion, and international relations. The Ptolemaic monarchy understood that control of knowledge was a prerequisite for the control of people. The redactors of Alexandria were thus not merely scholars, they were functionaries within a knowledge security complex. Importantly, the involvement of the state also provided cover for acts of suppression. Scrolls that contained politically inconvenient or subversive ideas could be quietly removed or permanently altered under the guise of scholarly refinement. The opaque nature of the editorial process meant that such interventions left few traces. Over time, the distinction between intellectual editing and political censorship became meaningless. The library presented itself as a beacon of enlightenment, but beneath this veneer was a tightly monitored apparatus for the production of compliant thought. The role of the Ptolemaic state in shaping, funding, and directing the redactional enterprise of Alexandria cannot be overstated. It created the institutional conditions for redaction to flourish as both a technical and ideological practice. The dynasty's involvement ensured that editorial decisions were not isolated acts of scholarship, but components of a comprehensive strategy of control. What was preserved, what was lost, and what was transformed were all contingent on political calculation. In understanding who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, the Ptolemaic regime emerges as both architect and beneficiary. It did not merely sponsor the library, it weaponized it. The redactions it oversaw and authorized served a dual function: to produce intellectual legitimacy for the rulers and to eliminate dissenting frameworks that could destabilize their rule. In this sense, the library was not a site of universal knowledge, but a site of curated memory and strategic forgetting. The institutionalization of redaction in Alexandria was not limited to grammarians and cataloguers. Philosophers themselves played a critical role in shaping the content and trajectory of ancient texts. These philosopher redactors, many of whom were embedded in the Mausion or directly associated with its intellectual circles, did not approach texts as neutral objects. They treated them as vehicles for embedding metaphysical, ethical, and ontological systems. Their engagement with manuscripts went far beyond commentary. They modified, reinterpreted, translated, and in many cases rewrote existing materials to reflect their philosophical convictions. The result was not merely editorial refinement but ideological recalibration. The core of this phenomenon lies in the philosophical claim to universality. Each school operating within or in dialogue with the Alexandrian infrastructure believed that it held access to foundational truths about the cosmos, the soul, and the structure of knowledge. Consequently, texts that contradicted or complicated their doctrines were treated not as alternate viewpoints but as errors in need of correction. Redaction thus became a philosophical imperative. It was a means to align the historical record with what was presumed to be metaphysical necessity. One of the earliest figures implicated in this process was Callimachus. Though best known for his bibliographic work, Callimachus was deeply invested in shaping how myth and poetry were interpreted. His aesthetic philosophy rejected the long, epic narrative style associated with Homer, favoring instead tightly composed, elusive works that reflected refined learning. This philosophical orientation influenced which texts were preserved and how they were classified. By privileging certain poetic forms and marginalizing others, Callimachus restructured the literary canon in accordance with his philosophical commitments. His pinakes did not merely organize knowledge, they filtered it through a lens of intellectual elitism. Another key figure was Aristarchus of Samothrace. Although often presented as a technical philologist, Aristarchus also held implicit philosophical commitments, particularly a strong alignment with rationalist and Stoic tendencies. His extensive work on Homer involved not only line-by-line commentary, but also the insertion of interpretive glosses that redefined mythic narratives in more abstract moralistic terms. He omitted what he considered irrational or inconsistent content, thereby stripping texts of their polysemous and often disruptive layers. These omissions were not arbitrary. They reflected a desire to align ancient poetry with a coherent moral order, one compatible with the philosophical orthodoxy of the time. Similarly, the Stoics, who held considerable influence in Alexandria, approached texts with a teleological orientation. They believed that all things were interconnected within a rational cosmic order, and this belief shaped their interpretive methods. Stoic scholars often read ancient myths as allegories of natural, law or ethical instruction. In doing so, they redacted literal or ritualistic elements that conflicted with their rationalist theology. For example, violent or erotic passages might be reinterpreted as metaphors or removed entirely if they resisted such transformation. The result was a corpus of texts that appeared internally coherent, but was, in fact, heavily manipulated to fit a predetermined worldview. Neoplatonists who emerged in the later phases of Alexandria's intellectual history continued and expanded this trend. They regarded ancient texts, particularly those attributed to Orpheus, Hermes Trismegistus, and Plato, as vehicles for esoteric wisdom. Redaction in their hands became a tool for mystical synthesis. Texts were reordered, interpolated, or rewritten to create hidden correspondences between different traditions. The boundaries between authorship and commentary collapsed. A single passage could be layered with philosophical reinterpretations, often without any clear indication of where the original ended and the redactor began. The integrity of the source material was subordinated to the coherence of the philosophical system. The philosopher-redactors also played a crucial role in the transmission of non-Greek knowledge. When Indian, Persian, or Egyptian texts were translated into Greek, these figures often served as intermediaries. They did not merely transcribe, they interpreted. Foreign concepts were mapped onto Greek philosophical categories, even when the underlying assumptions were incompatible. This translation as redaction created a hybrid discourse that obscured the original epistemic frameworks. For instance, cosmologies that emphasized cyclical time or non-dualism were restructured to fit linear, dualistic models prevalent in Hellenistic philosophy. The philosopher-redactor did not see this as distortion, but as clarification. In their view, they were extracting the hidden truth behind foreign myths. A significant example of such cross-cultural redaction can be found in the treatment of Hermetic texts. These writings, attributed to the semi-divine figure Hermes Trismegistus, drew from Egyptian, Greek, and possibly Chaldean sources. The Alexandrian philosophers who compiled and edited these texts shaped them into a coherent philosophical system that supported their metaphysical dualism, hierarchical cosmology, and theory of the ascent of the soul. Elements that contradicted this system, such as political critiques, ritual prescriptions, or alternative cosmological sequences, were removed or rephrased. The Hermetic corpus that survives today is not an archaeological artifact of a single culture, but a curated amalgam tailored to fit Neoplatonic priorities. Redaction also extended to historiography. Philosophers writing historical treatises often restructured timelines, emphasized moral lessons, and inserted causal explanations that reflected their theories of fate, virtue, or providence. Historical events were not merely reported, they were interpreted to illustrate philosophical principles. This practice obscured the distinction between historical narrative and philosophical treatise. It also created a recursive dynamic in which philosophical theories shaped historical redactions, which in turn reinforced those theories. The philosopher-redactor became both a commentator on the past and a constructor of it. These interventions were not always hidden. In some cases, redactors openly stated their intentions, arguing that their alterations restored the text to its true meaning. Yet even this transparency functioned as a form of epistemic control. By claiming authority over interpretation, the philosopher-redactor positioned himself as the final arbiter of truth, effectively displacing the original author. When such redacted texts were reintroduced into the educational or religious mainstream, they carried with them the ideological imprint of their editors. Future readers encountered not the original, but a version, one crafted to serve a particular metaphysical, ethical, or political purpose. The power wielded by these philosopher-redactors was immense. They determined which texts would survive, in what form and under what interpretive schema. Their revisions were incorporated into manuscript traditions, disseminated through scholarly networks, and later codified by religious institutions. In many cases, no unedited versions of the texts remain. The surviving corpus of ancient philosophy, religion, and science is thus heavily mediated by the decisions of a relatively small group of philosopher editors who operated under specific intellectual and political pressures. Understanding this dimension of redaction clarifies the degree to which philosophical commitments shaped the ancient textual record. The interventions of the philosopher-redactors were not incidental. They were integral to the construction of what is now considered classical knowledge. These figures did not merely interpret the world, they restructured its memory. By recasting myths as metaphors, translating rituals into ethics, and reordering cosmologies to fit abstract systems, they redefined what counted as legitimate thought. In doing so, they became the invisible authors of an inherited intellectual legacy built not only on transmission, but on transformation. The Alexandrian redactional enterprise did not operate in an intellectual vacuum. It unfolded in a highly competitive environment characterized by the coexistence, and often confrontation, of rival traditions. These traditions extended beyond internal Greek philosophical sects and included a wide range of foreign systems of thought: Persian dualism, Indian metaphysics, Babylonian astrology, Phoenician mythology, Carthaginian historiography, and others. Each of these systems presented not only alternative cosmologies and ontologies, but also competing historical narratives and epistemic authorities. In this environment, redaction functioned not only as a means of internal harmonization, but as an apparatus for ideological exclusion. The redaction of opponents, whether through omission, reinterpretation, or substitution, was a deliberate process aimed at epistemological supremacy. The central challenge these rival traditions posed was not their difference per se, but the threat they represented to the Alexandrian and Hellenistic intellectual order. These traditions often carried with them well-established textual corpora, priestly lineages, and interpretive methods. Their cosmologies and metaphysics could not be easily absorbed into Greek philosophical categories without friction. This friction prompted a systematic response to either assimilate the rival tradition under a modified framework or redact it to the point of irrelevance. In both cases, the opponent was neutralized, not by open refutation, but by editorial displacement. A key target of redaction was the Babylonian tradition, particularly in its astronomical and theological dimensions. Babylonian records extended over millennia and contained detailed celestial observations, complex mathematical schemes, and theological interpretations that placed divine agency within cycles of celestial time. While Alexandrian scholars adopted some of the numerical models, especially for planetary motion, they rejected the interpretive systems accompanying them. Babylonian cyclical time conflicted with the Hellenistic preference for linear causality and rational teleology. As a result, the raw data were extracted, reformulated in Greek idioms, and republished without the theological scaffolding that had originally structured them. In this way, Babylonian science was partially preserved but philosophically neutered. Persian Zoroastrianism posed a different kind of challenge. Its radical dualism, with two eternally opposed principles of good and evil, contradicted the monistic tendencies of much Greek thought. Zoroastrian cosmology did not allow for a harmonious or unitary cosmos governed by logos, as Stoic and Neoplatonic doctrines required. Moreover, Persian historical memory framed itself in opposition to Hellenic encroachment, particularly following the Greco-Persian Wars. Alexandrian scholars responded to these challenges not through engagement but through systematic marginalization. Zoroastrian texts were rarely translated directly. Instead, fragments and summaries were inserted into secondary works, often reinterpreted, through allegorical readings that erased their dualistic core. This editorial filtering rendered the Persian intellectual system intellectually safe by transforming it into a vague spiritualism compatible with Greek categories. The Carthaginian tradition, though largely destroyed following the Punic Wars, also faced editorial erasure. Carthage had its own annals, religious texts, and mercantile records, most of which disappeared in the aftermath of Rome's victory. Alexandria, functioning within the broader Greco-Roman imperial circuit, played a role in this erasure by participating in the selective documentation of Mediterranean history. Carthaginian accounts of their own origins, expansion, and religion were either excluded from the Alexandrian corpus or reframed through Greek and Roman stereotypes of barbarism and ritual cruelty. The lack of surviving Punic texts is not merely an accident of war, it is also the result of editorial priorities that dismissed Carthaginian voices as unworthy of preservation. Phoenician traditions were handled with greater care, particularly because of their influence on early alphabetic writing and their proximity to Hellenic colonies. However, Phoenician theological and cosmological concepts, such as their pantheon or sacred kingship models, were often rewritten to fit into Hellenistic syncretic frameworks. The Phoenician god El became associated with Kronos or Saturn. Baal was mapped onto Zeus. This equivalence was not neutral. It subordinated Phoenician religious identity to a Greek interpretive framework, effectively absorbing it while erasing its uniqueness. Original meanings were lost as texts were edited to conform to the typologies of comparative mythology favored in Alexandria. Indian philosophical and astronomical knowledge presented a special case. Although contact between the Hellenistic world and the Indian subcontinent increased after Alexander's campaigns, and Indian emissaries visited Alexandria during the early Ptolemaic period, the textual transmission was partial and heavily mediated. Indian cyclic cosmology, atomistic theories, and theories of language, particularly in the traditions of Nyaya, Samkhya, and Mimamsa, had no direct analogues in Greek thought. When fragments of Indian texts did reach Alexandrian scholars, they were often extracted for exotic value or reframed in esoteric allegory. The result was a caricature, an India of mystics and sages devoid of rigorous logic and empirical knowledge as constructed by the redactive filters of Alexandrian philosophy. Jewish texts, most notably the Hebrew Bible, were subjected to redaction through translation and reinterpretation. The Septuagint, the Greek version produced in Alexandria, introduced numerous changes in syntax, order, and theological emphasis. The Hebrew concept of YHWH was rendered into Greek forms that aligned more comfortably with Hellenistic philosophical theism. Moreover, political undertones in prophetic texts, especially those concerning empire, exile, and divine justice, were muted or removed. These changes were not accidental. They reflected an editorial interest in presenting Jewish texts as philosophically respectable and politically unthreatening within a multicultural but tightly controlled Hellenistic framework. Even within the Greek world, redaction served to sideline internal opponents. Sophistic traditions, skeptical philosophies, and heterodox cults were often treated with suspicion. Texts attributed to figures like Protagoras, Diagoras, or early materialists were frequently lost or survive only in hostile quotations. When preserved, they were often redacted to emphasize their errors or inconsistencies. The objective was not to debate these thinkers, but to reduce their legacy to intellectual curiosities or moral warnings. This internal redaction paralleled the external suppression of non-Greek traditions, illustrating a consistent strategy of narrowing the field of legitimate discourse. The mechanisms of redacting opponents operated on multiple levels. At the textual level, they involved omission, interpolation, and selective translation. At the institutional level, they entailed cataloging practices that excluded certain works or classified them under dismissive categories. At the interpretive level, they relied on allegorical readings that redefined the meaning of foreign concepts. These mechanisms were reinforced by the broader geopolitical and cultural context of Alexandria, a city at the intersection of empire, commerce, and ideology. The consequences of this systemic redaction were far-reaching. The philosophical canon that emerged from Alexandria was not a neutral inheritance but a constructed artifact. It represented the consolidation of one epistemic order at the expense of many others. Traditions that resisted assimilation were marginalized, their texts altered or lost. What remained was a curated collection that reflected the values, assumptions, and strategic interests of a specific intellectual elite operating under state patronage. To understand who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, one must recognize that the suppression of rivals was not a peripheral activity, it was central to the redactional project. The exclusion of competing systems of knowledge was not an incidental byproduct, it was a goal. The creation of a unified, internally coherent body of thought required the active silencing of discordant voices. In this light, the Alexandrian library was not merely a site of collection, it was a site of conquest. The opponents of this conquest were not only military or political entities, but epistemological frameworks that had to be erased, rewritten, or appropriated to sustain the illusion of universal knowledge under Hellenistic control. A central tension within the Alexandrian knowledge regime was the conflict between esotericism and accessibility. While the Library of Alexandria is often imagined as a beacon of public enlightenment and open scholarship, the reality of its operation suggests a fundamentally stratified model of knowledge access. This stratification was not simply a matter of class or literacy, it was embedded in the ideological infrastructure of the library itself. Esoteric knowledge, hidden, symbolic, and restricted, was not merely tolerated, it was cultivated, protected, and enforced. At the same time, accessible texts, those intended for wider dissemination, were often subjected to simplification, redaction, or strategic distortion. The result was a bifurcated system in which public knowledge functioned as a derivative, echo of a concealed, controlled corpus. Esotericism, in the Alexandrian context, was not incidental. It was institutionalized through mechanisms of textual curation, linguistic coding, and physical access restrictions. The library was embedded within the Mausion, a royal foundation whose members operated under state patronage and internal selection. Scholars lived in residence, engaged in state-sanctioned research, and enjoyed exclusive access to certain materials. The internal rules governing scroll circulation and reproduction remain undocumented, but circumstantial evidence suggests a tightly regulated hierarchy. The most sensitive scrolls, those involving theological secrets, state chronologies, foreign doctrines, or experimental science, were unlikely to be accessible to visiting scholars, let alone the public. They were reserved for an inner circle. Texts with theological or mystical content were particularly susceptible to esoteric containment. Hermetic writings, Chaldean oracles, Egyptian liturgies, and fragments from Eastern traditions often contained coded language, allegorical layers, or ritual prescriptions that were intelligible only to initiates. These texts were preserved not for public education, but for restricted philosophical exploration. Even their redaction followed esoteric principles. Symbols were left unexplained, hierarchies of being were implied rather than stated, and certain doctrinal claims were hidden behind mythological metaphor. The goal was not to obscure by accident, but to encode by design. Knowledge was treated as dangerous, powerful, transformative, and therefore requiring protection. This protection created a second tier of texts, those for general accessibility. These were often moralistic, simplified, and aligned with the dominant Hellenistic ideology. Mythological narratives were retold with philosophical glosses, histories were cleansed of heretical episodes, and cosmologies were reconstructed along rationalist lines. These texts served both an educational and a disciplinary function. They instructed readers in acceptable frameworks while discouraging inquiry into deeper layers. Their simplicity was not a concession to public understanding. It was a mechanism of epistemic boundary setting. The public received only what had passed through multiple layers of filtration. Translation was a critical component of this bifurcation. Texts that originated in non-Greek languages were rendered into Greek, often with heavy redaction. But the translated versions rarely captured the full conceptual apparatus of the originals. For example, Egyptian ritual texts involving multi-level initiations were sometimes collapsed into generic theistic narratives. The precise function of the ritual, its metaphysical assumptions, and its symbolic structure were lost or deliberately omitted. The resulting Greek text was more accessible, but fundamentally less accurate. In this way, translation became a tool for creating controlled accessibility, an appearance of openness that concealed epistemic reduction. Cataloging practices further reinforced this division. Esoteric texts were often classified under obscure or misleading headings. Some were attributed to mythical authors or grouped under mystical traditions with no clear definitional boundaries. Others were omitted from catalogues entirely, preserved in storage but functionally invisible. Meanwhile, publicly promoted texts were given clear attribution, thematic classification, and interpretive commentary. This differential treatment ensured that only certain forms of knowledge circulated within intellectual networks, while others remained hidden unless deliberately sought by initiates. The philosopher redactors played a key role in maintaining this dichotomy. Their commentaries often hinted at deeper meanings without disclosing them fully. Neoplatonic writings, for instance, referenced higher levels of interpretation accessible only to the philosophically trained. Allegorical readings became a sanctioned method of hiding meaning in plain sight. A myth could be read as entertainment by the public, as ethical instruction by students, and as metaphysical allegory by initiates. The same text operated on multiple levels, but its full depth was accessible only to a select group. This structure created a built-in hierarchy of understanding, reinforcing social and intellectual stratification. This division was also reflected in pedagogical practices. Public lectures, textbooks, and basic manuals disseminated simplified versions of canonical works. These versions often omitted contradictory evidence, divergent cosmologies, or disputed interpretations. Meanwhile, private instruction within elite circles involved reading unredacted fragments, cross-textual comparisons, and exposure to alternative doctrines. The two systems coexisted but were fundamentally unequal. Public education became a process of indoctrination, while elite education preserved and deepened the complexity of the knowledge base. Importantly, this stratification was justified on philosophical grounds. Many Alexandrian thinkers believed that truth was not only difficult to attain, but potentially harmful in the wrong hands. Exposure to metaphysical or cosmological insights without proper preparation could lead to confusion, rebellion, or nihilism. This belief legitimated the construction of intellectual barriers. The esoteric system was framed as necessary for both moral and political stability. Redaction was thus not only an editorial act, it was a form of epistemic engineering, shaping both what was known and who could know it. The political utility of this structure cannot be overstated. By tightly controlling access to sensitive texts, the Ptolemaic regime ensured that potentially destabilizing ideas, cosmological pluralism, anti-dynastic prophecies, radical ethical doctrines remained confined. At the same time, by promoting sanitized, accessible texts, they fostered a public image of enlightenment and rational governance. This dual system allowed the state to claim both intellectual openness and ideological unity. It diffused criticism while concentrating control. The legacy of this bifurcation is still felt today. Many surviving texts from the Alexandrian period reflect the simplified, redacted versions that were permitted wide circulation. The original esoteric texts, where they survive, do so in fragmentary, obscure, or heavily interpolated forms. The deeper traditions they represent have been partially erased, not through destruction, but through containment. The appearance of accessibility was maintained, the content was carefully managed. Understanding this dynamic is essential for any investigation into the redaction of ancient texts. The conflict between esotericism and accessibility was not a philosophical accident. It was a structural feature of the Alexandrian knowledge regime. It served both epistemic and political purposes. It defined not only what knowledge was available, but who was allowed to possess it, interpret it, and transmit it. Redaction in this context was not simply about altering texts. It was about maintaining a regime of visibility and invisibility, determining which truths would circulate freely and which would remain veiled behind layers of institutional secrecy. Redaction in the Alexandrian context was deeply entangled with religious concerns, not as a matter of preserving theological integrity, but as a tool for enforcing doctrinal alignment across diverse belief systems. The intersection between religious narrative, philosophical abstraction, and political ideology formed one of the most powerful zones of textual control within the library's editorial architecture. Rather than treating sacred texts as inviolable, Alexandrian redactors often approached them as mutable vessels, subject to adaptation, condensation, or transformation to fit overarching philosophical systems or dynastic strategies. In this way, religious redaction was not merely a defense against heresy. It was a technique for constructing a state-compatible theology. The most visible manifestation of this practice was the redaction of imported religious texts, particularly those from Semitic and Egyptian traditions. As the Ptolemies sought to synthesize Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern cosmologies into a coherent imperial theology, they relied on redactors to restructure contradictory narratives. The cult of Serapis exemplifies this dynamic. Introduced by Ptolemy I, Serapis was presented as a deity that fused Osiris with Apis, while also carrying attributes of Zeus and Hades. Such a synthesis was not the product of organic theological evolution. It was engineered through redacted mythologies. Scrolls that contained genealogies, liturgies, and cosmogonies were edited to support the legitimacy and philosophical coherence of this composite deity. Ritual elements incompatible with Greek, sensibilities such as animal mummification or obscure funerary rites were suppressed or translated into symbolic language. The result was a theological artifact constructed to bridge religious populations under a unified imperial myth. This unification strategy extended to the reinterpretation of older Egyptian texts. The pyramid texts, coffin texts, and Book of the Dead underwent transformations when accessed by Alexandrian redactors. Their polytheistic multiplicity, ritual complexity, and emphasis on the afterlife conflicted with Hellenistic moral philosophy and natural order cosmology. Therefore, redactors reframed these texts through an allegorical lens. Deities were moralized, spells were translated as ethical principles, and narratives of divine conflict were subdued in favor of harmony and hierarchical resolution. The doctrinal chaos of ancient Egyptian religion was redacted into a more comprehensible system, one that could be assimilated into Greek philosophical frameworks such as Stoicism or Neoplatonism. The same pattern can be observed in the translation and redaction of Hebrew scriptures. The Septuagint, produced in Alexandria under royal patronage, was not a word-for-word transfer of the Hebrew Bible. It represented a selective adaptation influenced by the theological, linguistic, and philosophical filters of its time. Certain Hebrew terms had no Greek equivalents and were rendered using more abstract or neutral terms. The monotheistic exclusivity of the Hebrew texts was often softened through ambiguous translations. Legal codes were rendered in a more philosophical tone, and prophetic denunciations of empires were diluted to avoid subversion of the Alexandrian regime. While the Septuagint was later canonized by Christian traditions, its original construction must be understood as a redacted document designed to harmonize a monotheistic tradition with the syncretic and pluralistic religious framework of the Hellenistic world, redaction was also deployed to marginalize religious competitors. Gnostic, Orphic, and mystery cult texts that circulated within or near Alexandria often contained cosmologies, myths, and soteriological claims that challenged official narratives. These texts tended to emphasize cosmic dualism, secret revelation, and hierarchical layers of divine beings, many of which undermined the philosophical simplicity and moral clarity favored by mainstream Platonism or Stoicism. Redactors faced a choice: neutralize these texts through allegorical reinterpretation, or allow them to disappear through non-preservation. In most cases, they chose the latter. While fragments of these traditions survive, many were likely lost, due to their exclusion from catalogues, lack of institutional copying, or deliberate omission. Their doctrines did not align with the politically sanctioned religious philosophy of unity, hierarchy, and rational cosmos. Therefore, they were made invisible. The redaction of religious texts also served the purpose of sanitizing myth. Ancient myths were not coherent systems. They were layered, contradictory, and deeply regional. Their inclusion in the Alexandrian corpus required rationalization. Redactors often reduced complex polytheistic traditions to hierarchical genealogies, removed taboo or violent elements, and aligned divine actions with ethical principles. In this way, myth became philosophy, and gods became moral metaphors. This transformation was ideologically significant. It allowed the state to claim divine sanction without confronting the irrational or subversive content embedded in older mythological systems. Textual redaction also played a role in reconciling astrology, divination, and temple ritual with philosophical determinism. Many religious traditions incorporated divinatory practices based on lunar calendars, planetary conjunctions, or animal sacrifice. Such practices clashed with the emerging intellectual consensus around natural law and cosmic rationality. Rather than reject these practices outright, redactors recast them. Rituals became symbolic gestures, planetary deities were translated into metaphysical principles. The redacted versions retained surface elements of the original practices while stripping them of their operational power. This move preserved the cultural prestige of ancient religious knowledge while rendering it intellectually inert. Linguistic redaction was a further layer of doctrinal alignment. Religious texts translated into Greek were often subjected to vocabulary filtering. Terms with strong metaphysical or theurgical implications in their source languages were rendered in more neutral or abstract forms. For instance, Egyptian terms for divine embodiment or ritual efficacy were translated into Greek as logos, nous, or psyche, thus aligning them with philosophical rather than religious categories. These linguistic shifts had far-reaching consequences. They altered the theological assumptions of the texts and ensured that their content was compatible with the prevailing doctrinal expectations of the library and its affiliated institutions. The editors who carried out these redactions were not anonymous scribes, but philosopher-priests and state-affiliated scholars. Their work was rarely marked as editorial. Instead, it was embedded seamlessly into the manuscript tradition. This concealment ensured that future generations would treat the redacted versions as authoritative, unaware of the layered transformations they had undergone. In this way, the redacted religious texts became both monuments to Alexandrian syncretism and instruments of epistemic control. The alignment of religious texts with official doctrine had long-term effects. It established the precedent for later theological consolidation, including early Christian canon formation and Islamic textual standardization. Many of the structural principles, harmonization, simplification, exclusion, and allegorical reinterpretation, originated in the Alexandrian redactional regime. These principles would go on to shape the very idea of what a sacred text should be: coherent, hierarchical, ethically instructive, and politically unthreatening. In the Alexandrian context, religious redaction was not merely a matter of theological curiosity. It was a calculated intervention in the formation of belief. The goal was not to document religious diversity, but to engineer religious unity, one that could support a cosmopolitan empire underwritten by philosophical rationalism and divine kingship. The library became the crucible in which theological multiplicity was reduced to strategic coherence. To ask who redacted the books of Alexandria and why is to confront this religious layer of editorial activity directly. The answer is clear: those who stood to benefit from a managed cosmology, philosopher-statesmen, royal patrons, and priestly scholars. The redacted texts they produced were not records of belief, they were scripts for belief, designed to enforce doctrinal boundaries and suppress theological ambiguity. They defined what could be said about the divine, and in doing so they reshaped the intellectual landscape of ancient religion under the guise of preservation. Among the most consequential but least scrutinized dimensions of Alexandrian redaction is the manipulation of chronology. The sequencing of historical events, the placement of dynasties, the duration of epochs, and the synchronization of civilizations were not fixed frameworks handed down intact from the past. They were constructed, contested, and, within the Alexandrian system, systematically reshaped. Chronological redaction served not merely to correct inconsistencies or standardize measurements of time, it was a tool for ideological alignment, imperial legitimacy, and philosophical coherence. Through the deliberate rewriting of time itself, the Alexandrian apparatus sought to organize memory in a manner that validated present structures of power. The central figure in the redaction of ancient chronology was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the chief librarian at Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. His chronology, which attempted to date events from the Trojan War through Greek history to his present, was not simply a scientific exercise, it was a political and philosophical project. By establishing a coherent timeline, Eratosthenes provided the Ptolemaic regime with a historical scaffolding that linked it to the heroic age of Greece. The placement of key events, such as the founding of Troy or the arrival of the Greek gods, was synchronized with dynastic milestones. This alignment was not inevitable, it was constructed. Eratosthenes chose certain sources, excluded others, and resolved contradictions in ways that privileged Greek continuity and cultural centrality. This chronological system became hegemonic, largely due to Alexandria's dominance in textual preservation and distribution. Earlier, non-Greek systems of timekeeping, such as Egyptian regnal years, Mesopotamian king lists, or Persian Zoroastrian calendars, were either translated into Greek frameworks or disregarded. Their incompatibility with the Alexandrian system rendered them suspect or obsolete. In many cases, redactors adjusted timelines to force alignments between events that had no historical synchronization. For example, Egyptian dynasties were squeezed or extended to fit the genealogies of Greek myths. Such adjustments erased indigenous temporal frameworks and imposed an artificial uniformity. Redaction of chronology also occurred within the literary and religious texts housed in the library. The Septuagint provides a striking example. The genealogical and chronological sequences in the Hebrew Bible were modified in translation to produce smoother numerical patterns and to harmonize with Greek historiography. Ages of patriarchs were adjusted, durations of exiles modified, and intervals between events recalculated. These changes were often subtle but cumulative. They served to render the Hebrew narrative compatible with Greek systems of order and time, thereby facilitating its inclusion in the broader Alexandrian intellectual corpus. The manipulation of chronology was not limited to ancient myths or religious traditions. It extended to historical figures and events. The timelines of philosophers, poets, and rulers were coordinated to create meaningful convergences. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were positioned within a clean sequence, minimizing the messy overlaps. and regional disparities that actually characterized their lives. The goal was to create a historical narrative that reflected teleological development, a progression from myth to reason, from disorder to rationality. This narrative was itself a redactional artifact, crafted, stabilized, and disseminated through Alexandria's editorial machinery. One of the most significant consequences of this chronological redaction was the marginalization of traditions that operated with alternative conceptions of time. Indian cosmology, with its kalpas and yugas, vast temporal cycles spanning billions of years, could not be reconciled with the finite and linear timelines preferred by Hellenistic thinkers. As a result, Indian chronology was treated as mythical or symbolic, rather than as a legitimate framework. Similarly, Babylonian astronomical cycles, with their emphasis on recurrence and divine timing, were reduced to numerical data stripped of temporal meaning. The Alexandrian model could accommodate data, but not epistemologies. Anything that disrupted the linear progression of rational civilization was excluded or reformulated. Chronological redaction also served imperial ends. The Ptolemies sought to portray themselves as inheritors of a continuous civilizational arc, stretching from pharaonic antiquity through classical Greece to their own enlightened rule. To do this, they needed to eliminate or obscure periods of interruption, conquest, or cultural inversion. Chronological gaps were filled with manufactured continuity. Rival dynasties were compressed into brief interludes. Foreign dominations were downplayed. These editorial strategies transformed a fragmented past into a smooth trajectory, one that culminated in the Alexandrian present. The library did not merely preserve history, it produced a version of history that justified current political realities. These manipulations were often concealed through the apparatus of authority. Texts containing the revised chronologies were attributed to respected scholars, embedded within widely circulated manuscripts and taught as foundational knowledge. The appearance of systematization masked the interventions behind it. Charts, tables, and synchronized events conveyed an aura of objectivity, even as the underlying data had been selectively altered. Over time, the redacted chronologies became canonical. Later historians, theologians, and philosophers inherited them without access to the original alternatives, which had been removed from catalogues, not copied or destroyed. This loss has had enduring consequences. The absence of unredacted chronological systems from Alexandria has distorted modern understandings of ancient temporalities. Historians today continue to grapple with inconsistencies in king lists, calendar systems, and cultural timelines, often unaware that these inconsistencies were introduced not by chaos in the ancient world, but by the editorial harmonization imposed in antiquity. The Alexandrian system, once established, became the baseline against which all other chronologies were measured and found wanting. Importantly, the redaction of chronology was not a neutral mistake or an artifact of limited information. It was an intentional act designed to produce historical coherence where there was none and to suppress temporal frameworks that challenged the primacy of the Hellenistic worldview. It created a historical structure in which everything led to Greek rationality, imperial order, and philosophical clarity. It denied the plurality of historical experience and replaced it with a single narrative arc. To revisit the question, who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, requires full recognition of this temporal dimension. Redactors did not merely edit content, they edited time. They imposed order on historical memory, not to clarify the past, but to reshape it in the image of the present regime. Chronology was not a neutral backdrop, it was a field of power. In controlling the sequence of events, the Alexandrian redactors controlled causality, meaning, and legitimacy. This manipulation of time remains one of the most insidious legacies of the Alexandrian project. it hides itself in footnotes, reference, systems, and canonical frameworks. Its success lies in its invisibility. Only by recognizing chronology as a redacted artifact can we begin to disentangle the constructed nature of our inherited historical timelines and see through the veil of continuity that was deliberately drawn over a fractured, contested, and plural past. Among the many categories of knowledge subject to Alexandrian redaction, none were more vulnerable to total exclusion or obliteration than heretical texts, works that challenged prevailing metaphysical systems, political structures, or religious orthodoxy. These were not simply minor variations or alternative readings. They represented categorical disruptions to the constructed narrative order of the Alexandrian regime. As such, they were not preserved, harmonized, or debated. They were removed. Their authors were anonymized or vilified, their doctrines reclassified as errors, and their textual traces systematically purged from catalogues and circulation. In the architecture of the Alexandrian knowledge system, heresy was not tolerated. It was rendered epistemologically impossible. The definition of heresy in this context cannot be limited to theological deviation. In the Alexandrian framework, heretical texts included any materials that introduced ontological plurality, epistemic decentralization, or cosmological models incompatible with Hellenistic metaphysics. The heretical was that which exposed the constructed nature of the canon itself. Texts that implied that meaning was not fixed, that historical memory was contested, or that the divine was fragmented and multiple. The redactors recognized that these texts posed not simply a threat of contradiction, but a threat of disintegration. Their existence undermined the integrity of the entire redacted edifice. The mechanisms of exclusion were varied. The most direct method was non-preservation. Texts simply were not copied. In an age where manuscript survival depended on continual reproduction, a text not transcribed was a text condemned to oblivion. The Alexandrian scribal economy, tightly controlled by institutional priorities, ensured that heretical works failed this test. If a scroll entered the library and was deemed subversive, it was allowed to decay, mislabeled, or withheld from all catalogues. These acts left no direct evidence, no lists of banned books, no recorded denunciations, but their effect was absolute. The scroll ceased to exist as a transmissible object. In cases where heretical texts were too widespread to be ignored entirely, more complex strategies were deployed. Redactors inserted interpolations into the text to weaken or distort the original argument. Key terms were replaced with ambiguous or misleading alternatives. The text was reframed as allegorical, thereby evacuating its direct implications. In extreme cases, the entire document was attributed to a known fool, criminal, or adversary, rendering its content suspect by association. These interventions were rarely disclosed. The text appeared intact, but its meaning had been systematically undermined. Surviving evidence of this process can be found in how later authors refer to lost works. Multiple ancient sources cite books, doctrines, and cosmologies that no longer exist. They mention opponents whose arguments are paraphrased, but whose writings have vanished. Often, the only record of these texts comes from hostile quotations, excerpted in order to be refuted. In this way, the memory of heresy was preserved only through its condemnation. The text itself was erased, but its shadow remained, embedded in polemic. The redactors thus succeeded in shaping not only what was preserved, but how the erased was remembered. One class of heretical texts likely targeted in Alexandria were the so-called pre-Socratic cosmologies that did not conform to later Platonic or Aristotelian frameworks. Philosophers like Anaximander, Heraclitus, or Empedocles proposed cosmological systems that emphasized flux, multiplicity, or cyclical destruction, concepts that resisted the emerging emphasis on a rational, stable hierarchical universe. Many of their original works survive only in fragments, preserved in later commentaries that often present them through distorting lenses. Whether these texts were excluded from Alexandrian catalogues or simply deprioritized in copying schedules is unknown. What is clear is that their marginalization coincides with the canonization of more systematized philosophical systems whose redacted texts formed the basis of the later curriculum. Gnostic literature presents another striking case. Though flourishing in the early centuries CE, much of Gnostic theology likely had earlier antecedents in Hellenistic Alexandria. These systems posited a dualistic universe in which the creator God was not the highest deity, and salvation required secret knowledge, gnosis, inaccessible to the public. Such doctrines undermined both the philosophical unity and political theology promoted by the Alexandrian elite. The library's redactors, closely aligned with state and philosophical orthodoxy, would have viewed these texts as fundamentally dangerous. Their exclusion from mainstream catalogues and manuscript transmission ensured that only fragments, recovered in later archaeological discoveries like Nag Hammadi, survived to hint at what had been lost. Similarly, ancient theogonies that diverged from the classical Olympian model, such as those associated with Orphic or Thracian traditions, were subject to redaction or elimination. These alternative creation myths often presented the cosmos as emerging from violence, fragmentation, or primordial darkness, in contrast to the rationally ordered universe of Stoic or Platonic metaphysics. They also frequently involved rituals of death and rebirth that conflicted with the emerging ethical model of civic virtue and personal rationality. In the redacted Alexandrian corpus, these texts were either rewritten as poetic metaphor or removed entirely. Their ritual function was dissolved into abstract interpretation, and their cosmological implications were neutralized. Historical narratives that presented dissonant timelines, anti-imperial sentiment, or non-Hellenistic origins also fell within the heretical category. Accounts from Phoenician, Carthaginian, or Persian sources that suggested the inferiority or late arrival of Greek civilization were systematically ignored or altered. The redacted histories that emerged from Alexandria depicted a world in which Greek culture emerged naturally, inevitably, and at the apex of human development. Any alternative genealogy, whether literary, theological, or historical, was treated as deviant, excluded. Heresy in this sense was not only theological, it was civilizational. The fate of heretical texts in Alexandria also reveals a deeper epistemic asymmetry. The library, while claiming to preserve universal knowledge, operated on principles of selective forgetting. It was not an archive of what humanity knew, but of what a specific elite deemed permissible to know. The criteria for exclusion were often implicit, embedded in cataloguing choices, copying schedules, and interpretive glosses. The heretical text was not banned, it was rendered illegible, inaccessible, or irrelevant. The cumulative effect of these practices was to create an illusion of coherence in the ancient intellectual record. The multiplicity of views, the contradictions, the unresolved cosmologies, all were smoothed over through strategic absences. The surviving corpus, filtered through centuries of Alexandrian redaction, appears stable and internally consistent. But this consistency is a product of erasure. The canon is not a record of the best ideas, it is a record of the ideas that survived. The process of ideological filtration. To understand the question of who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, the treatment of heretical texts is essential. It reveals that redaction was not only about shaping what was known, but about ensuring what could not be known. The library was not a passive victim of historical accident or fire. It was an active site of knowledge engineering where ideas were judged, edited, and eliminated according to standards invisible to the modern reader. The heretical texts, Those that fell outside the constructed boundaries were not lost by chance. They were lost by design. The process of redaction within the Library of Alexandria was not openly acknowledged in its own time. Unlike modern editorial practices, which often include marginalia, revision history, or authorial notes, Alexandrian redaction was characterized by silence and opacity. The figures who altered, reorganized, or removed elements from the texts typically left no trace of their interventions. These invisible editors were not rogues or outliers. They were institutionally embedded actors working within sanctioned frameworks, applying methodologies that were not only accepted but expected. Their anonymity was not an oversight. It was a structural feature of the system they served. This invisibility was facilitated by the nature of ancient manuscript culture. Scrolls were copied by hand, often repeatedly, and the very act of copying provided ample opportunity for change. Unlike print cultures that preserve prior states through editions and archives, scroll-based transmission allowed edits to replace originals entirely. Once a change was made, there was no accessible mechanism to distinguish it from the author's intent. Over generations, these layers of unmarked intervention accumulated until they formed the new canonical version, often without any reader. Being aware of the editorial sediment beneath. The professional role of the Alexandrian scribe-philologist blurred the lines between copier, interpreter, and redactor. Scholars in the library were tasked not just with preserving texts, but with improving them, clarifying language, harmonizing inconsistencies, and aligning arguments with contemporary norms. In practice, this meant rewording passages, inserting transitional phrases, omitting disruptive sections, and rearranging content to conform to a preferred logic. These interventions were rarely documented. The final manuscript carried only the name of the original author, lending a false aura of authenticity to the redacted content. One reason for this invisibility was epistemological. The prevailing intellectual culture in Alexandria prioritized coherence, systematization, and alignment with philosophical ideals. Texts that deviated from these standards were viewed as defective rather than distinctive. Redacting them was not considered deception, but restoration, correcting a corruption to recover a purer form of truth. The editor's hand was effaced, not because it was hiding, but because it believed it was revealing. In this sense, invisibility was a marker of legitimacy. The best redaction was the one that left no visible trace. Institutional incentives reinforced this logic. Scholars whose emendations became standard gained reputational prestige, but their names were not affixed to the altered texts. Instead, they were cited in critical annotations, scholia, or teaching lineages, which were themselves subject to later redaction or omission. Over time, even these secondary acknowledgments could disappear, leaving behind a text whose revised form appeared original. The redactor thus disappeared into the structure of the work, their influence embedded in syntax, argument, and narrative flow, but nowhere explicitly declared. This practice created enormous challenges for modern philology. Attempts to reconstruct original texts from later manuscripts are often confounded by the lack of clear markers indicating where and when changes occurred. Competing manuscript traditions sometimes reveal variants, but the logic behind those variants remains opaque. Did a passage differ because it preserved an older version, or because a later editor imposed a new interpretation? Without editorial records, it is impossible to know. The invisible editor leaves behind a text that is legible but not transparent. The effects of this invisibility were not uniform. Some texts were more heavily redacted than others, depending on their perceived importance, ideological alignment, or textual condition. Works attributed to canonical authors, such as Homer, Plato, or Aristotle, received extensive attention, their texts scrutinized and modified to ensure consistency with the evolving intellectual canon. lesser known, or foreign texts were often redacted in broader strokes, simplified or truncated to fit within established categories. In both cases, the absence of editorial attribution rendered the process seamless. Readers encountered only a finished text, unaware of the decisions that had shaped its current form. In certain instances, redactions created composite texts, combining elements from multiple sources into a unified whole. These were sometimes presented as single-author works, even when internal evidence suggests multiple hands. Philosophical treatises, mythological compilations, and historical chronicles all exhibit signs of such composite construction. Yet because the editing process was silent, the boundaries between sources were effaced. The invisible editor became an invisible author, crafting synthetic works that passed as originals. The anonymity of redaction also served strategic purposes. By concealing the human agency behind textual modification, the library preserved the illusion of objectivity and permanence. Texts appeared as relics from antiquity, untouched by the vicissitudes of interpretation. This stability reinforced their authority. A text that had survived unaltered from the distant past carried more weight than one visibly tampered with. The redactors understood this dynamic and worked to maintain it. Their edits were designed to be undetectable, not because they feared exposure, but because they sought to preserve the cultural fiction of unbroken transmission. This cultural fiction had political utility. Texts that appeared ancient and unaltered could be invoked as evidence for contemporary ideological claims. They were used to justify dynastic succession, legal norms, philosophical systems, and theological doctrines. The invisible editor made these texts compatible with the needs of the present while cloaking that compatibility in the aura of timeless wisdom. In this sense, redaction was not merely an academic practice, it was a mechanism of statecraft. By hiding the fact of editing, the Alexandrian regime could present its preferred narratives as eternal truths rather than recent constructions. Even where editorial intervention was acknowledged, it was often minimized. Prefatory remarks, where they existed, described changes in vague terms, corrections, clarifications, restorations. The specifics of what had been changed and why were rarely disclosed. Readers were encouraged to trust the judgment of the editor, without knowing the scope of their intervention. This trust was institutionalized, embedded in the reputation of the library and the authority of its scholars. The invisible editor did not ask for recognition, they asked for belief. The invisibility of redaction in Alexandria thus represents a form of epistemic power. It allowed editors to shape the content, structure, and interpretation of texts without accountability or transparency. Their decisions defined the boundaries of legitimate knowledge while maintaining the illusion that those boundaries had always existed. This power was exercised not through censorship alone, but through authorship, silent, concealed, and absolute. In the broader investigation into who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, the figure of the invisible editor becomes central. It reveals that the architecture of knowledge was not merely constructed by visible hands, rulers, philosophers, scribes, but by unseen forces operating within a system that rewarded erasure. The redactor did not sign their work because the signature would betray the system's foundations. That knowledge, as preserved in the library, was not inherited, but curated, not discovered but decided. The texts redacted in Alexandria did not remain confined within its walls. Through a complex network of scribal transmission, diplomatic exchange, conquest, and intellectual migration, these texts traveled, physically and conceptually, into the archives of Rome, the scriptoria of Byzantium, and the scholarly institutions of the Islamic world. But the process of transmission did not preserve them as static artifacts. With each relocation, each translation, and each recopying, Alexandrian texts were subjected to further layers of modification. Redaction was not a singular act but a continuous cumulative process. What emerged centuries later in monasteries, palaces, and theological schools were not original manuscripts but transformed iterations, filtered, reframed, and selectively preserved according to new epistemic and ideological criteria. The first major wave of transmission occurred with the Roman absorption of Egypt. Following the death of Cleopatra VII and the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty in 30th BCE, Alexandria fell under Roman administration. Roman elites, eager to appropriate Hellenistic knowledge for political and cultural legitimacy, transported numerous texts to Rome. Some were looted directly from the library, others acquired through intermediaries, and still others entered Romany collections via the private libraries of Alexandrian scholars who fled or were invited into imperial circles. This movement did not preserve the integrity of the Alexandrian corpus. Instead, texts were recatalogued, translated into Latin, and often adapted to Roman rhetorical, legal, or imperial values. Philosophical treatises were turned into moral manuals. Historical chronicles were revised to foreground Roman achievement. In Rome, Alexandrian texts acquired a new function. They became instruments of cultural self-fashioning. The Roman intellectual elite, figures like Cicero, Seneca, and Pliny, engaged with these texts as both models and foils. The texts were selectively cited, paraphrased, or incorporated into new compositions. This incorporation often blurred the boundary between source and commentary. Roman versions of Greek texts, especially those on ethics, cosmology, and natural history, became hybrid documents. The Alexandrian redactions themselves, already modified from their presumed originals, were now subjected to further filtration. These layers of appropriation further obscured the editorial history of the texts. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not halt transmission. In Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire inherited a substantial portion of the Alexandrian intellectual legacy. Greek remained the dominant language, which allowed for greater continuity in textual preservation. But even here, redaction continued. Theological priorities of the Orthodox Church led to selective copying of texts that aligned with doctrinal orthodoxy. Heretical, pagan, or overtly esoteric materials were either suppressed or repurposed. Manuscripts were recopied with marginalia that reframed their meaning in theological terms. Platonic and Aristotelian works were filtered through Christian metaphysics. In many cases, scribes added glosses, interpretations, or summaries that reshaped the intellectual tone of the original. Moreover, the Byzantine scribal tradition engaged in its own cataloguing and classification practices, distinct from the Alexandrian model. Texts were grouped not by the logic of the Mausion, but by ecclesiastical hierarchy, scriptural utility, or liturgical function. This reorganization altered how texts were accessed, read, and interpreted. Philosophical treatises were placed alongside theological polemics, scientific writings near hagiographies. The context of reading shifted, and with it, the meaning of the texts themselves. The invisible Alexandrian redactor was now joined by a Byzantine counterpart, equally anonymous, equally decisive. The Islamic world introduced a new and transformative layer of transmission. During the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly in the 8th to 10th centuries CE, a major translation movement emerged centered in Baghdad. Under the patronage of rulers like Al-Ma'mun, Alexandrian texts, often via their Byzantine intermediaries, were translated into Arabic. These included works on logic, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Translators such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Thabit ibn Qurra not only rendered the texts into Arabic, but commented upon them, revised problematic passages, and adapted foreign concepts to Islamic theological and scientific frameworks. In this process, Greek terms lacking equivalents in Arabic were either redefined or substituted. Texts on metaphysics were reframed in light of Islamic monotheism. Treatises on ethics were aligned with Quranic moral codes. Concepts of divine logos or emanation were recast within Islamic cosmology. These translations became authoritative, texts within Islamic intellectual culture forming the basis for original philosophical systems developed by thinkers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd. But the Alexandrian origin of many of these texts, already heavily redacted, was now layered with Islamic interpretive structures. The result was not a return to the original, but the creation of a new textual identity. This reappropriation was not passive. Islamic scholars often critically evaluated the Alexandrian corpus, accepting, rejecting, or modifying arguments based on empirical evidence, theological coherence, or logical clarity. The redactional inheritance of Alexandria was thus both preserved and contested. In some cases, Islamic scholars accused their Greek predecessors of error, inconsistency, or superstition. These critiques, though often framed as commentaries, were in fact acts of intellectual redirection, new redactions that inserted alternative priorities and values into the evolving corpus. The final major wave of transformation came with the Latin translations of Arabic texts during the European Middle Ages and Renaissance. Texts that had already passed through Alexandrian, Byzantine, and Islamic filters were now translated into Latin, often with extensive reinterpretation. The scholastic tradition, exemplified by Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, relied heavily on these retranslated sources. These Latin texts often became the authoritative versions within Western Europe, further distancing them from their Alexandrian foundations. Errors introduced through multiple stages of translation, editorial biases, and theological reframing compounded the difficulty of tracing the original structure and intent of the texts. Each phase of transmission, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, and Latin, was accompanied by loss, substitution, and reinterpretation. Physical deterioration of manuscripts led to lacunae that were restored by later scribes, often using their own judgment. Political upheavals led to the destruction of libraries and archives. Shifting ideological climates dictated which texts were copied, which were burned, and which were left to decay. The Alexandrian redactions that began as efforts to harmonize knowledge under Hellenistic ideology eventually became the substrates for new systems of thought, each transforming the texts anew. The cumulative effect of these transformations is that no Alexandrian text survives in its original form. What we have are sedimented layers of editorial decision, each one shaped by the values, fears, ambitions, and ideologies of its moment. The Alexandrian redactor may have set the foundation, but the edifice was continually remodeled, rebuilt, and repurposed. The content of the texts changed, but so did their function. They ceased to be archives of ancient knowledge and became instruments for new epistemic orders. To inquire into who redacted the books of Alexandria is to engage not only with ancient editors, but with an entire chain of redactors stretching across centuries and civilizations. Each link in this chain reshaped the texts while preserving the illusion of continuity. The Library of Alexandria, therefore, was not just a source of lost knowledge, it was a point of origin for an enduring process of knowledge manipulation. Its legacy is not preserved in a single manuscript, but in the redacted histories, altered doctrines, and reframed philosophies that still define the intellectual architecture of the modern world. Amid the many transformations undergone by texts, originating in or filtered through Alexandria, one of the most opaque and controversial repositories of potential pre-redacted knowledge remains the Vatican Library. Established formally in the 15th century under Pope Nicholas V, The Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana grew from earlier ecclesiastical collections and papal archives, acquiring, preserving, and systematizing a vast corpus of ancient manuscripts. Among these were Greek and Latin works, some transmitted through the Islamic and Byzantine traditions, others acquired from monastic scriptoria across Europe. Rumors and claims persist that within the sealed or restricted sections of this archive lie copies, fragments, or variants of Alexandrian texts that diverge markedly from the redacted versions available to public scholarship. Whether such manuscripts are genuine pre-redacted artifacts or simply later variants is difficult to verify. Access to key sections of the Vatican Library remains restricted, and even for authorized researchers, catalogue descriptions are often vague or incomplete. Yet from scattered references in scholarly footnotes, archival inventories, and accounts by early Renaissance scholars, there are indications that certain documents in the Vatican's possession contain alternative chronologies, theological formulations, and cosmological models that were purged or transformed during the Hellenistic redactional wave. These variants, if authentic, may preserve traces of knowledge systems erased elsewhere. The Vatican's role in the preservation and possible concealment of these texts must be understood within its own redactional history. Like Alexandria, the Church maintained a strict hierarchy of interpretive legitimacy. The consolidation of Christian orthodoxy in the late Roman Empire and early Middle Ages involved extensive editorial work. Apocryphal Gospels were suppressed, heterodox theologians denounced, and liturgical practices standardized. When ancient manuscripts were acquired, they were not simply stored, they were evaluated. Those compatible with Catholic doctrine were preserved and sometimes published. Those deemed dangerous were hidden, destroyed, or kept under classification. This ecclesiastical censorship mirrored the Alexandrian principle of redacting to align with ideological norms. During the Renaissance, as humanist scholars sought access to Greek texts, the Vatican opened portions of its holdings. Figures like Poggio Bracciolini, Lorenzo Valla, and later Erasmus were granted limited access. They copied and edited classical manuscripts, reintroducing them into European intellectual life. However, their access was partial and supervised. The possibility remains that texts deemed theologically or philosophically subversive were withheld. Even in cases where original manuscripts were made available, editorial intervention, both ancient and ecclesiastical, complicated the issue of authenticity. Scholars were often unaware that they were engaging with layered redactions rather than untouched originals. Reports from early Jesuit missionaries and Vatican archivists suggest that certain collections contain documents of uncertain provenance or non-canonical writings in pre-Greek dialects. These euphemistic descriptions could indicate fragments of Alexandrian works not conforming to standard philosophical or religious categories. References to Chaldean tables, Egyptian theological codices, or unclassified cosmogonies in Vatican inventories are tantalizing. Their contents remain unverified in most cases. The very ambiguity of their description suggests either intentional obfuscation or lack of scholarly engagement, a silence that recalls the practices of invisible editors in Alexandria. There are also records of theological councils citing texts held in confidence by the Vatican as evidence for doctrinal decisions. Such references, notably lacking public documentation or citations, imply the existence of internal textual authorities not accessible to wider scholarship. While not direct evidence of Alexandrian manuscripts, they indicate an editorial culture in which selective disclosure of texts serves institutional aims. If these hidden documents include alternate versions of classical works, philosophical, astronomical, or historical, they may contain content suppressed during the original redaction processes in Alexandria. The possibility that the Vatican Library houses pre-redacted Alexandrian materials is further complicated by its role in controlling translations. During the Counter-Reformation, the Church took a more aggressive role in overseeing biblical and classical translations. Texts that deviated from Vulgate orthodoxy were banned. Vernacular translations were vetted line by line. This practice extended to classical authors as well, whose pagan ideas were tolerated only insofar as they could be harmonized with Christian morality. If unredacted versions of texts survived in the Vatican, they would likely have been deemed too dangerous for public release. Importantly, some of the earliest printed editions of ancient works, those produced by Vatican-sanctioned presses, exhibit variations from manuscripts found elsewhere. These variations are often dismissed as scribal error or editorial discretion. Yet, a systematic analysis reveals patterns, the smoothing of contradictions, the moralization of ambiguous content, and the alignment of cosmological references with Christian creationism. This pattern mirrors earlier Alexandrian redactional principles, suggesting that the Vatican did not merely inherit the Alexandrian corpus, it adopted and extended its redactional methods. The Vatican's archival secrecy has also fueled numerous speculative claims, ranging from plausible historical hypotheses to conspiratorial theories. Some posit the existence of Vatican codices containing pre-Socratic or Eastern philosophical texts untouched by Hellenistic rationalism. Others claim the Church holds suppressed records of ancient scientific knowledge, geography, medicine, astronomy, that contradict established canons. While many of these assertions lack empirical grounding, they arise from a legitimate historical pattern, the intersection of power and knowledge, and the institutional tendency to conceal what it cannot assimilate. From a historiographical standpoint, the Vatican Library must be viewed as a critical yet opaque link in the redactional chain that began in Alexandria. It inherited a corpus already subjected to ideological filtering and may have continued this filtering under new theological imperatives. Its vast holdings are both a potential archive of suppressed knowledge and a monument to centuries of editorial consolidation. The texts it possesses, known and unknown, are not neutral remnants of the past but curated artifacts embedded in institutional agendas. In the broader investigation into who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, the Vatican represents a late-stage inheritor and possible preserver of that legacy. Its role is not merely as an archivist but as a gatekeeper, shaping the narrative of classical and religious thought through access, classification, and interpretation. Whether it contains unredacted Alexandrian texts remains uncertain. What is clear is that its holdings cannot be divorced from the historical processes of redaction, censorship, and doctrinal engineering that defined the Alexandrian project. It is a continuation of that project, another layer in the architecture of constructed memory. To understand the scale and consequence of Alexandrian redaction, one must confront the fundamental question: what was lost? This is not a rhetorical inquiry but a forensic one. It seeks to identify, not through speculation but through evidence of absence, the types of knowledge that may have once existed but were erased, suppressed, or never allowed to circulate. Because the redactional system was structured to conceal its omissions, the only way to access what was lost is through the traces it left behind: fragmented references in hostile sources, marginal citations in later texts, inconsistencies in timelines, or unexplained gaps in surviving corpora. These absences are not blank spaces, they are artifacts of intervention. They speak, albeit obliquely, to a vast body of intellectual material removed from the historical record. The most immediate form of loss is textual. Entire works known to have existed by their titles, authors, or citations have disappeared. Ancient bibliographies, such as those of Callimachus or Diogenes Laertius, refer to hundreds of texts for which no manuscript survives. Some of these were scientific treatises, astronomical models, geographical compendia, mathematical theories, and early anatomical writings. Others were historical or philosophical, accounts of civilizations not integrated into the Greco-Roman narrative, alternative, metaphysical frameworks, or critiques of dominant ideologies. These texts were not destroyed by fire or natural decay alone. Many were victims of deliberate neglect or ideological editing decisions that deemed them irrelevant, dangerous, or redundant. Among the most significant losses may be those related to ancient science. While some fragments of pre-Alexandrian knowledge systems survive through second-hand transmission, such as Babylonian astronomical tablets or Egyptian medical papyri, the full structure of these sciences was often redacted in Alexandria. When Babylonian data were absorbed by Alexandrian scholars, the cosmological and theological assumptions accompanying them were stripped away. The numbers remained, but the interpretive systems that gave them meaning were lost. Similarly, ancient Indian mathematical concepts such as positional notation or early zero theory were occasionally referenced but rarely preserved in full, suggesting that their systemic context was either misunderstood or deliberately excluded. Another category of loss involves alternative chronologies and historical narratives. Competing accounts of human origins, civilizational development, and regional histories, those preserved in Phoenician annals, Egyptian temple records, or Persian royal archives, were either excluded from the Alexandrian canon or reinterpreted to conform with a linear, Greek-centered historical model. The absence of detailed records from these traditions is often attributed to the fragility of papyrus or political upheaval, but many of these materials passed through Alexandria at some point. Their disappearance reflects a choice not to preserve or to preserve only selectively. This editorial selectivity functioned as a filter, ensuring that only those historical sequences which reinforced the Alexandrian worldview were retained. Religious and cosmological losses are equally profound. The Hellenistic synthesis of theology, especially through redacted versions of Egyptian, Semitic, and Indo-European traditions, left behind only those elements which could be harmonized into a rational, hierarchical cosmos. More ambiguous, or chaotic systems, those involving cyclical destruction, divine plurality, or unknowable forces, were edited out. These systems often carried with them ritual practices, initiatory knowledge, and symbolic languages that now survive only as fragments. Gnostic texts discovered in the 20th century at Nag Hammadi suggest the scope of what may have been lost: complex mythologies with sophisticated psychological, cosmological, and ethical dimensions entirely absent from the Alexandrian record. In literature, losses include variant versions of foundational texts. The Homeric epics, for example, are known to have existed in multiple regional recensions prior to their standardization in Alexandria. These versions likely contain divergent characterizations, episodes, and moral emphases. The Alexandrian editors, particularly Aristarchus, chose which lines to retain, which to discard, and how to annotate the remainder. The canonical Homer, known today as a product of those decisions. What was removed, perhaps politically charged verses, local traditions, or inconsistent theology, is unrecoverable. Yet the very presence of scholia referencing spurious lines attests to a substratum of now lost variants. Another dimension of loss is conceptual. Ideas not preserved in full cannot simply be reassembled from fragments. The context in which they were understood, the worldview, language, ritual, and community that sustained them, has often vanished. For instance, when Neoplatonist philosophers refer to earlier Orphic or Chaldean materials, they do so through the lens of their own metaphysics. The original concepts are not quoted, they are absorbed and reframed. This reframing itself becomes the historical record. What is lost is not just content but epistemological possibility. The range of what could be thought, said, or imagined was narrowed by redaction, and what lies beyond that boundary cannot be fully reconstructed. Loss also occurred in how knowledge was categorized. The Alexandrian system of classification privileged certain genres, philosophy, poetry, mathematics, while devaluing others, such as ritual manuals, oral narrative traditions, or applied craft. Texts falling outside of the recognized schema were less likely to be copied, annotated, or cited. Even when preserved in storage, they remained intellectually invisible. This form of taxonomic erasure continues to affect modern scholarship, which often mirrors the Alexandrian categories without questioning their historical origin. In this sense, the redactional regime did not just remove texts, it shaped the very structure of the archive. Perhaps the most insidious loss is that of intellectual dissent. The record of ancient philosophy appears more uniform than it was, not because agreement prevailed, but because disagreement was edited out. Radical skeptics, materialists, or anti-rational mystics are rarely preserved in full. Their ideas survive, if at all, as caricatures in the works of opponents. This one-sided survival skews our understanding of ancient debate, making it appear as a consensus where none existed. The loss is not only of content but of dialectical balance. An entire spectrum of thought was erased, leaving only those strands that could be domesticated into systems of coherence. The redacted corpus that survives is thus not representative of the ancient world in its complexity. It is a curated abstraction, tidied, aligned, made consistent. The material that resisted alignment was excluded, and its exclusion has shaped the trajectory of intellectual history. The loss is not incidental, it is systemic. It reflects the priorities of institutions, the pressures of ideology, and the mechanics of preservation. It is the result of decisions made, quietly, anonymously, and irrevocably, by those who controlled the means of copying, cataloguing, and interpreting texts. To ask what was lost is also to ask what could have been, what philosophical trajectories were foreclosed, what sciences might have developed differently, what histories might have been told. These questions cannot be answered definitively, but they remain essential. They point to the constructed nature of our intellectual heritage and the silences that underpin it. Every surviving text is a survivor of editorial violence. Every absence is a clue to a lost archive. In this sense, the redactional legacy of Alexandria is not only about what we have, it is about what we lack. It is about the intellectual, historical, and spiritual possibilities that were denied transmission. To reconstruct those possibilities is not merely a scholarly task. It is an act of epistemic recovery, a confrontation with the fact that the history of thought is also the history of forgetting, and that the forgetting was engineered. The systematic redaction of texts in Alexandria was not merely an intellectual enterprise nor a scholastic tradition divorced from broader material conditions. It was, at its core, an imperial strategy, a mechanism for consolidating and legitimizing power across culturally, linguistically, and religiously heterogeneous populations. By exercising control over knowledge, the Ptolemaic dynasty and its successors could assert control over identity, history, and even the structure of reality itself. Redaction was not the byproduct of empire. It was one of its primary instruments. It functioned as a method of epistemic governance, shaping not only what subjects knew, but how they knew it and whom they were allowed to become as a result. The nature of the Ptolemaic Empire required such a strategy. Ruled by a Greek elite over an Egyptian majority and positioned at the intersection of African, Asian, and Mediterranean worlds, the regime could not rely on ethnic or religious homogeneity for stability. Instead, it cultivated a synthetic identity, part Greek rationalism, part Egyptian sacred kingship, part cosmopolitan pragmatism. To maintain this fusion, the empire had to manage the competing traditions within its borders, and more crucially, the narratives those traditions told about the origins of the world, the nature of the divine, and the legitimacy of power. Redaction became a means of enforcing narrative uniformity in the face of cultural pluralism. The Library of Alexandria in this framework served as more than a research institution. It was an imperial archive, a knowledge factory where disparate intellectual materials were brought under the control of a centralized authority. Scrolls acquired through conquest, diplomacy, or trade were subjected to editorial review. Inconsistent cosmologies were harmonized, conflicting historical timelines were synchronized, disparate religious doctrines were aligned or erased. The result was an artificial coherence, a corpus of texts that supported the ideological pillars of the empire: divine monarchy, philosophical hierarchy, and rational order. Such coherence was not passive. It was produced through active intervention. Philosophical texts were redacted to reflect teleological structures compatible with Hellenistic metaphysics. Religious texts were edited to suppress tribal particularism and emphasize universal moral laws. Scientific treatises were cleaned of ritual language and reframed in terms of predictable laws and causes. All of these editorial moves worked toward a single end: the production of a worldview in which the Ptolemaic regime could be seen as the natural culmination of civilization's progress. Redaction also facilitated imperial control by managing time. As discussed previously, Alexandrian chronologies compressed or extended dynastic reigns, redated pivotal events, and synchronized disparate calendars to align with Greek historical models. These timelines legitimized the current order by creating an imagined continuity stretching back to divine or mythic origins. Dynasties that preceded or threatened the Greek presence were minimized. Local gods were retrofitted into Hellenistic pantheons. The resulting historical narrative was not a record, it was propaganda. It made the empire appear not only as a political inevitability but as a metaphysical necessity. Further evidence of redaction as imperial strategy can be seen in the classification systems developed within the library. Callimachus's Pinakes, often celebrated as a bibliographic achievement, also functioned as a tool of epistemic segregation. Texts were organized in ways that mirrored the political order. Greek works were placed at the center, foreign texts at the margins. Categories of genre, topic, and author were deployed to privilege certain forms of knowledge while obscuring or compartmentalizing others. The very act of cataloging was a form of ideological ordering. It determined which texts were visible, which were peripheral, and which were excluded entirely. This system extended beyond the library into educational policy. The curriculum imposed on elite Alexandrian students reinforced the edited canon. Young scholars learned philosophy through texts already redacted for consistency. They studied history through timelines already realigned to reflect imperial succession. They engaged with religious texts stripped of local cultic specificity. The result was a class of intellectuals trained not to question the epistemic order, but to reproduce it. Redaction ensured that even those who studied the past would see it only through the lens of present power. The state's involvement in redaction was not merely permissive, it was directive. Patronage determined which scholars received access to the library's materials, which editions were copied and distributed, and which interpretations were supported by institutions. Dissenting scholars, those who resisted standard interpretations or preserved heterodox texts, found themselves without funding, without scribes, and without audiences. Over time, such intellectuals either conformed, disappeared, or had their work altered posthumously. The redaction of ideas, therefore, extended to the redaction of persons, the erasure of alternative schools, traditions, or lineages that might have disrupted the official synthesis. Redaction also served external imperial purposes. As Alexandrian texts circulated across the Hellenistic world, they carried with them the philosophical and theological assumptions embedded in their edits. This exportation of redacted knowledge helped to standardize thought across a fragmented empire. Provincial elites trained in Alexandria brought back with them the edited canon, spreading not only the texts, but the worldview they embodied. In this way, redaction became a soft weapon of imperial unification, achieving by epistemic alignment what could not be secured by military force alone. Importantly, the redactional strategy of empire did not end with the Ptolemies. Roman, Byzantine, and later, ecclesiastical authorities inherited both the redacted texts and the practice of ideological editing. Each regime added its own layer of control, modifying the content and function of the Alexandrian corpus to serve new ends. The imperial strategy of redaction thus became a trans-historical project, perpetuated not because of conspiracy, but because of structural continuity. Each new system required coherence, and each turned to the textual inheritance of Alexandria to secure it. What was lost in this process was not only knowledge, but possibility, the possibility of thinking otherwise. Competing cosmologies, non-linear histories, anti-authoritarian philosophies, and local mythologies were eliminated not through argument, but through omission. Redaction foreclosed the alternatives before they could be known. The empire did not merely destroy its rivals, it erased their memory and colonized their intellectual terrain. In examining who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, the answer cannot be reduced to a list of names or institutions. The redactors were agents of a system, participants in a strategic enterprise that used textual control to produce political and metaphysical authority. They did not merely preserve knowledge, they administered it. They did not merely organize texts, they restructured the world. Redaction was their instrument, empire their context, and power their enduring goal. Modern historiography has long revered the legacy of Alexandria, especially its library, as a monument to intellectual ambition and a symbol of ancient enlightenment. This reverence, however, has often blinded historians to the redactional processes that underpin the institution's operations. The very disciplines that claim to trace the trajectory of knowledge, philology, philosophy, history of science, have inherited a canon that was shaped by suppression, selection, and ideological engineering. Yet this inheritance is seldom interrogated with the necessary skepticism. Instead, Alexandrian texts are frequently treated as neutral data points, as if their survival and form were the result of objective forces rather than deliberate intervention. This historiographical blind spot perpetuates the illusion of continuity and obscures the systemic redaction that structured the archive from its inception. One of the key reasons for this oversight lies in the methodologies of modern scholarship. Historical critical methods tend to focus on verifying authenticity, resolving textual variants, or tracing manuscript lineages. While these are valid pursuits, they often neglect the broader context in which texts were shaped. The assumption is that the primary problem is corruption, accidental errors introduced by copyists, rather than intentional redaction driven by political, religious, or philosophical agendas. This assumption skews analysis toward recovery rather than critique. It encourages the search for a stable original rather than an interrogation of how and why that original may have been overwritten. Moreover, the modern idea of the classical text is itself a product of the Alexandrian project. The works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and others have come down to us in forms largely determined by Alexandrian editorial decisions. Their supposed coherence, consistency, and completeness are the results of redactional harmonization. Yet these qualities are taken as evidence of timeless genius rather than institutional shaping. Scholars praise the clarity of Aristotelian logic or the orderliness of Euclidean geometry without recognizing that the messier, contradictory, or alternative formulations may have been systematically removed. The clean lines of the classical canon are artifacts of erasure. This blind spot is further reinforced by educational traditions. From secondary schooling to university curricula, the canon is presented as a closed system, a body of works whose boundaries are fixed and whose internal logic is self-evident. Students are rarely taught to question why certain texts survive and others do not, or how the versions they read came into being. Critical awareness of redaction is relegated to niche scholarly debates, disconnected from the broader discourse on cultural transmission. As a result, even advanced scholarship often rests on unexamined foundations. Institutional inertia also plays a role. Academic disciplines are built on stable corpora, reliable texts, recognized interpretations, and shared assumptions. To acknowledge the depth of Alexandrian redaction would require destabilizing those foundations. It would cast doubt not only on individual texts, but on entire fields. How would one teach pre-Socratic philosophy if the surviving fragments are known to have been filtered through hostile or assimilative lenses? How could one reconstruct the history of ancient science if key principles were removed or rewritten to fit Hellenistic cosmology? The implications are too vast for most institutional structures to accommodate. There is also a psychological dimension. The idea of Alexandria as a lost utopia of knowledge satisfies a deep cultural longing for an intellectual golden age. It offers a narrative of tragic loss, the burning of the library, the disappearance of manuscripts, that allows modern institutions to see themselves as inheritors of a noble but incomplete legacy. This narrative positions contemporary scholarship as a redemptive effort, reclaiming fragments of a shattered whole. It is emotionally satisfying, but it is also misleading. It obscures the fact that much of what was lost was never simply destroyed. It was never preserved in the first place. The loss was not accidental. It was editorially orchestrated. Even when modern scholars acknowledge redaction, they often do so in technical terms. They discuss variant readings, note interpolations, or trace divergent manuscript traditions, but they rarely ask why these variants exist or what ideological work they perform. The political, religious, and philosophical pressures that shaped Alexandrian redaction are treated as background noise rather than central factors. The redactor is rendered a technician, not an agent of epistemic control. This minimizes the structural violence of redaction, the way it shaped not just individual texts, but the very possibility of alternative thought. A further obstacle to critical historiography is the inaccessibility of key archival resources. As discussed previously, institutions like the Vatican Library or certain monastic archives contain manuscripts that may preserve pre-Alexandrian or alternative versions of classical texts. Yet access to these materials is restricted, and the few studies that do emerge from them are often highly specialized. The result is a historiography that remains dependent on edited, published versions of texts, versions that continue to reflect Alexandrian priorities. The editorial apparatus, even when reprinted in modern critical editions, still masks the underlying absences. Digital humanities projects, while promising in scope, often replicate these blind spots. They digitize existing corpora, apply algorithmic analysis, or map citation networks, all based on already redacted texts. These tools increase access and analytical capacity, but they do not interrogate the foundation. They allow scholars to explore the canonical universe more efficiently, but not to question its construction. In this way, technology amplifies the canon's authority rather than deconstructing it. There are, of course, exceptions. Scholars who have drawn attention to the politics of canon formation, the ideology of textual editing, and the epistemic consequences of redaction. But these voices remain marginal, often relegated to the peripheries of academic discourse. Their work is cited in footnotes, included in bibliographies, and occasionally referenced in conferences, but it rarely reconfigures the central narrative. The blind spot remains intact, not because evidence is lacking, but because the structure of scholarship is not built to accommodate it. To challenge this blind spot requires a shift in orientation. Historiography must move from the reconstruction of texts to the deconstruction of archives. It must ask not just what is in the corpus, but what is missing and why. It must treat redaction not as a footnote, but as a primary object of study. This does not mean rejecting the classical canon, but resituating it as a curated artifact. It means acknowledging that what we take as the intellectual foundations of the West are not transparent reflections of ancient thought, but layered constructs shaped by centuries of editorial intervention. In the investigation of who redacted the books of Alexandria and why, modern historiography becomes part of the story. It has not only inherited the redacted corpus, but has often failed to question it. The blind spot is not accidental. It is the legacy of a system that normalized erasure as scholarship, suppression as preservation, and control as coherence. To see clearly, we must first recognize how much we have been trained not to look. The final question, who benefits from the redaction of the books of Alexandria, requires an answer not in terms of individual culprits or institutional blame, but in the structural consequences of control over knowledge. Redaction was not a singular crime with a tidy list of beneficiaries. It was a system of power sustained over centuries, operating through empires, institutions, and scholarly tradition that profited from epistemic consolidation. The benefits were not only political and religious, they were ontological. To control how the world is remembered, categorized, and made legible is to control what can be believed, taught, and imagined. Those who shaped the corpus of classical knowledge determined the conceptual boundaries of civilization itself. In the immediate context of Alexandria, the primary beneficiaries were the Ptolemaic rulers. They used the redacted corpus to reinforce their legitimacy as sovereigns over a culturally diverse population. Through editorial harmonization, they created a synthetic cosmology in which their regime appeared inevitable, divinely sanctioned, and intellectually superior. Redacted chronologies aligned their reign with mythical and heroic pasts. Redacted religious texts positioned them as custodians of sacred continuity. Redacted histories erased the discontinuities and conquests that had led to their ascension. This produced a politically useful narrative of unbroken wisdom centered on Alexandria and, by extension, on themselves. The second layer of beneficiaries were the philosopher-scribes and editorial elites. These individuals, employed by the library and the Mausion, were not passive custodians. They exercised discretionary control over which texts were preserved, modified, or discarded. In doing so, they positioned themselves as the interpreters of truth. Their role was neither neutral nor selfless. By shaping the archive, they elevated their own philosophical systems, suppressed rival frameworks, and embedded their intellectual authority in the fabric of classical education. Every time a student learned Homer from an Alexandrian recension or debated metaphysics using redacted Platonic dialogues, the authority of these editors was reinforced. Their benefits were reputational and ideological. A broader class of beneficiaries emerged as the Alexandrian corpus spread beyond Egypt. Roman imperial culture, especially from the late Republic onward, absorbed and weaponized Alexandrian redactions. Roman educators, administrators, and rhetoricians used the polished corpus to instruct elites in the values of order, rationality, and hierarchy. These values underpinned the Roman ideology of law, governance, and imperial destiny. In the process, Rome became the inheritor of a curated history, one that obscured the violence and erasure that made that history coherent. The Alexandrian redactions lent Roman expansion the legitimacy of continuity and the gravitas of intellectual refinement. The Christian Church, particularly during the post-Constantinian consolidation of orthodoxy, also benefited significantly. The Church adopted Alexandrian textual strategies, reinforcing them with theological imperatives. Theological redaction aligned with doctrinal formation, gospel harmonizations, the rejection of apocryphal texts, the synchronization of sacred history with imperial chronology. Alexandrian methods of textual filtration and philosophical alignment were absorbed into ecclesiastical practice. The result was a Christian canon deeply structured by earlier editorial logics. The Church inherited not only the content of redacted texts, but their rationale. It benefited by establishing a coherent theological worldview that, like its Alexandrian predecessor, could not be meaningfully challenged from within. Byzantine scholars, medieval monks, Islamic theologians, and Renaissance humanists all inherited the redacted legacy. Their institutions and intellectual traditions were built upon the foundation laid in Alexandria. Even as they debated interpretations or corrected transmission errors, they remained within the boundaries of an archive already shaped by suppression. Each group, in turn, became gatekeepers of a curated intellectual tradition, reaping the benefits of authority without confronting the full consequences of redaction. In the modern era, academic institutions continue to benefit from this legacy. Departments of classics, philosophy, theology, and the history of science trace their intellectual genealogies to the Alexandrian corpus. They rely on it for curricular, research, and cultural prestige. Libraries, universities, and publishers sustain their relevance through engagement with a canon that is still treated as a repository of timeless wisdom. Yet this canon is itself the product of centuries of omission. To question its construction is to question the legitimacy of the disciplines built upon it. Beyond institutions, entire civilizations have drawn legitimacy from the Alexandrian construct. Western modernity, with its claims to rational superiority, historical continuity, and philosophical centrality, derives part of its identity from the redacted narrative of Greco-Roman inheritance. The Enlightenment invoked this legacy as a source of universal reason. Colonial empires invoked it to justify domination. Contemporary technocratic ideologies invoke it to frame themselves as the inevitable outcome of historical progress. In each case, the redacted past is deployed as evidence of present authority. This is not to say that all engagement with classical texts is corrupt or illegitimate. The knowledge that survives is not without value, but it is not neutral. It has been curated, filtered, and structured by systems of power that determined what kinds of knowledge were permissible. The benefits of redaction, therefore, accrue not simply to those who held power in antiquity, but to those who continue to operate within its epistemic framework without questioning its foundation. The costs, conversely, are borne by those whose histories were erased, whose cosmologies were dismissed, whose sciences were ignored, and whose texts were never copied. The cultures and thinkers excluded from the Alexandrian project remain mostly invisible, not because their ideas lacked
merit, but because their survival was inconvenient.
Their loss is not just historical, it is ongoing. It shapes what questions we ask, what answers we consider plausible, and what futures we imagine. To ask who benefits from redaction is to ask who controls the archive, not just the physical repository of manuscripts, but the conceptual archive that defines what knowledge is and what it can be. The redactors of Alexandria understood this. They built an epistemic order that has endured for over 2 millennia. Their legacy is not a collection of scrolls, but a structure of thought, a map of what is knowable, with whole regions erased, mislabeled, or never drawn. In closing, the redaction of the books of Alexandria was not an isolated editorial project. It was a historical event of epistemic engineering whose consequences extend into every domain where knowledge is produced, distributed, and legitimated. It is a story not only of what was altered or lost, but of who continues to benefit from that loss. To understand redaction is to confront the architecture of memory itself and to begin the work of disentangling inherited knowledge from inherited power,